Imagine the dawn of 1865. For 4 long, brutal years, the United States has been a nation at war with itself. The grand experiment of a united republic is teetering on the brink of collapse, fractured by a conflict that has carved deep scars into the land and its people. This isn't just a political disagreement anymore. It's a visceral, soul-crushing struggle that has turned fields into graveyards and neighbors into enemies. In the North, a weary sense of determination hangs in the air. The initial patriotic fervor has long since faded, replaced by the grim reality of casualty lists that seem to stretch on forever. Families gather around firesides, reading letters from sons and husbands at the front, letters smudged with dirt and sometimes blood. They've seen President Lincoln re-elected, a mandate to see the war through to its conclusion. But the cost is staggering. Factories churn out weapons and uniforms at a relentless pace, but the human price is paid in homes draped in black. There's hope. Yes, a fragile hope fueled by recent victories, but it's a hope tempered by 4 years of profound loss. People are tired. They yearn for the simple return of peace, for the day when the telegraph brings news of victory, not another devastating battle. Down south, the situation is far more desperate. The Confederacy is a ghost of its former self, a proud and defiant nation now starving and threadbare. The Union blockade has squeezed the life out of its economy. Cities like Richmond, the Confederate capital, are crowded with refugees, and the specter of hunger is a constant, unwelcome guest. The once mighty armies are now composed of boys and old men, their uniforms ragged, their stomachs empty, yet a fierce, almost fanatical pride remains. They are defending their homes, their way of life, and for many, the institution of slavery they believe is their right. General Robert E. Lee, their revered commander, still inspires immense loyalty, a symbol of Southern honor against overwhelming odds. But even he can see the writing on the wall. The resources are gone. The manpower is dwindling. It's a cause bleeding out, sustained only by sheer willpower and a refusal to admit defeat. Across this divided landscape, the leaders on both sides can feel a seismic shift. The pieces on the grand chessboard are in their final positions. In his headquarters, Union General Ulysses S. Grant, a man of quiet, relentless tenacity, is planning his end. He's not a general of grand, sweeping gestures, but of grim arithmetic. He knows he has the advantage in men and materials, and he intends to press that advantage without mercy, grinding down Lee's Army of Northern Virginia until it can fight no more. Grant understands that this final push will be bloody, but he also believes it's the only way to end the slaughter for good. He's preparing for a spring campaign that he hopes will be the last. Meanwhile, Abraham Lincoln, now in his second term, contemplates the monumental task ahead. His speeches have evolved from calls to arms to profound reflections on the meaning of the war and the future of the nation. He's already thinking beyond the battlefield, grappling with the immense challenge of reconciliation. How do you heal a nation that has so violently torn itself apart? His mind is occupied with malice toward none and charity for all. But first, the fighting must stop. He trusts Grant to deliver the military victory, while he prepares for the moral and political battle of stitching the Union back together, of transforming a confederation of warring states back into a single family. For the soldiers in the trenches, life is a monotonous cycle of fear, boredom, and cold. They huddle in muddy ditches outside cities like Petersburg, Virginia, trading shots with an enemy they can often hear but rarely see. These are the veterans of Gettysburg, Antietam, and a dozen other bloody fields. They are hardened, cynical, and utterly exhausted. They dream of home, of a warm bed of a meal that isn't hardtack and salted pork. They write letters filled with a desperate longing for the war to end, one way or another. Every sunrise brings the possibility of a charge, of a sudden, violent death. They are the human costs of this conflict, the generations sacrificed on the altar of a divided ideology. And what of the millions of African Americans for whom this war means everything? For the enslaved in the Confederacy, every Union advance is a step closer to liberation. They risk everything to escape to Union lines, providing valuable intelligence and labor, with many taking up arms to fight for their own freedom in the United States colored troops. Their courage and determination are a powerful force, reshaping the very purpose of the war. In the North, free black communities watch with a mixture of hope and anxiety, praying that the promise of emancipation will be fully realized, that the end of the war will mean the beginning of true citizenship and equality. So this is America in early 1865, a nation on edge. It's a landscape of stark contrasts of grim determination in the north and desperate defiance in the south. It's a time of immense suffering, but also of transformative change. The air is thick with anticipation. Everyone, from the generals and presidents, down to the lowest private and the most isolated farmer, can sense that something is about to break. The long, dark night of civil war is nearing its end, but the dawn promises to be violent and uncertain. The final act is about to begin, and its conclusion will decide not only who wins the war, but what kind of nation the United States will become. Thank you for watching, and be sure to subscribe as we continue our journey through the final dramatic months of the American Civil War. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into Chapter 2, The Last Winter of the Confederacy. Imagine the biting cold of late 1864, a chill that seeped into the very bones of the Confederate cause. This wasn't just a season of snow and ice. It was a winter of despair, a final, grueling test of endurance for an army and a people on the brink of collapse. Let's set the scene. General Lee's Army of Northern Virginia is entrenched around Petersburg, Virginia, locked in a brutal siege with Ulysses S. Grant's Union forces. For months, these men have lived in a labyrinth of trenches, a muddy, miserable world of constant danger and deprivation. As winter tightens its grip, their situation goes from dire to desperate. The most immediate and gnawing problem was food. Rations, which had never been plentiful, were now reduced to almost nothing. The standard issue, if you could even get it, was a meager portion of cornmeal and a scrap of bacon, often rancid. Soldiers wrote letters home, their words painting a grim picture of gnawing hunger. One soldier from Georgia lamented that he had been as hungry as a wolf for days on end. Men became gaunt, their uniforms hanging off their skeletal frames. They'd forage for anything edible. Roots, nuts, even rats. The lack of nutrition led to widespread diseases like scurvy, dysentery, and typhoid, which swept through the camps, claiming more lives than Union bullets. The Army's horses and mules, essential for moving artillery and supplies, fared even worse. Thousands starved to death, their carcasses littering the camps, a stark symbol of the Confederacy's collapsing logistics. Then there was the cold. The soldiers' uniforms were in tatters. Many were barefoot, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. They lacked blankets, and their shelters were often just crude holes dug into the earth, covered with a flimsy piece of canvas. The firewood supply was exhausted for miles around the siege lines. Men huddled together for warmth, shivering uncontrollably through the long, dark nights. Frostbite was rampant, leading to amputations that further thinned the already depleted ranks. The psychological toll of this constant misery was immense. How could you fight for a cause when your body was screaming in protest? This hardship wasn't confined to the battlefield. Back home, the civilians were suffering just as intensely. The Union blockade had choked off imports, and the Confederacy's own infrastructure was in ruins. Railroads, vital for transporting food from the farms to the cities and the front lines, were destroyed or in disrepair. This created a paradox. There was food in some parts of the South, particularly in Georgia and Alabama, but no way to get it to the hungry soldiers in Virginia or the starving citizens in cities like Richmond. Inflation was out of control. Confederate money was nearly worthless. A barrel of flour, if you could find one, could cost over $1,000. Families of soldiers, who were supposed to receive support from the government, were left destitute. Women and children faced starvation. This led to bread riots in several cities, where desperate women, armed with knives and axes, broke into bakeries and warehouses, demanding food for their families. These acts of desperation showed the complete breakdown of social order and the government's inability to provide for its own people. The letters from home became a source of immense anguish for the soldiers. Wives wrote of their children crying from hunger, begging their husbands to come home. "My dear Edward," one letter read, "we have not a mouthful to eat. I am willing to go and work for the children's bread, but I can't get it." For a soldier already enduring the hell of the trenches, reading such words was devastating. It forced a terrible choice: loyalty to the Confederacy, or loyalty to your starving family. This crisis in morale was the Confederacy's most fatal wound. The rate of desertion skyrocketed during that final winter. It wasn't just a trickle, it was a flood. Men weren't necessarily turning traitor or joining the Union. They were simply walking away from the war to go home and save their families. General Lee himself acknowledged the crisis, reporting that hundreds of men were leaving his army every night. He understood their reasons, even as he knew it was gutting his army's strength. The will to fight was evaporating. The soldiers who remained were held together by a threadbare sense of duty and a deep personal loyalty to leaders like Lee. But even that was being stretched to its breaking point. The political leadership in Richmond seemed detached from this reality. President Jefferson Davis remained defiant, delivering speeches that promised victory was just around the corner. But for the men in the trenches and the women in the bread lines, these words rang hollow. They could see the truth with their own eyes. The Confederacy was starving, freezing, and bleeding to death. Think about the sheer human cost of this. Every soldier who deserted, every child who went hungry, every family torn apart by war. And these were the real tragedies of that last winter. It wasn't just about battles and strategies anymore. It was about survival. The grand ideals that had sparked the war 4 years earlier were now buried under a mountain of suffering. As 1864 turned to 1865, the situation became utterly unsustainable. Lee's army was a shadow of its former self, a ghost force trapped in the icy grip of winter and the tightening noose of the Union Army. The home front was collapsing, and the collective will of the South had been broken. The stage was set for the final act. The spring thaw would bring not renewal and rebirth, but the final, decisive campaigns that would end the war. That winter was more than just a period of hardship. It was the crucible in which the fate of the Confederacy was sealed. The defeat came not just from the Union army's overwhelming numbers and resources, but from within, from empty stomachs, frozen limbs, and broken hearts. It was a long, slow, an agonizing end, played out in the mud of Petersburg and the desolate homes across the South. The last winter of the Confederacy was, in essence, its death rattle. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of this final winter is a powerful reminder of the human toll of war, a side of the conflict we often overlook. Next time, we'll explore the spring campaign of 1865 and the final surrender at Appomattox. If you found this insightful, please hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss the conclusion of our series. See you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the American Civil War. Today, we're diving into Chapter 3, a pivotal moment when the very nature of the conflict began to shift dramatically. The year is 1864, and the Union finally has a commander with a singular, unyielding vision for victory, Ulysses S. Grant. Before Grant's appointment as General in Chief, the Union's military efforts were often fragmented. Different armies in different theaters of war operated almost independently. They'd fight a battle, then both sides would often retreat, rest, and refit for weeks, sometimes months. It was a war of intermittent, bloody clashes. Grant saw this as a critical flaw. He knew the Confederacy, with its smaller population and weaker industrial base, couldn't sustain a prolonged, continuous fight. Its greatest advantage was time, and the hope that the North would simply grow weary of the war. Grant decided to take that advantage away. His grand strategy, conceived in the spring of 1864, was revolutionary for its time. It was a symphony of destruction, a coordinated offensive across multiple fronts, all designed to happen at once. No more rest for the weary. No more opportunities for the Confederacy to shuttle troops from a quiet front to reinforce a threatened one. Grant's plan was to engage all of the Confederacy's major armies simultaneously, stretching their resources to the breaking point. The centerpiece of this strategy was the Army of the Potomac. Under the direct supervision of Grant himself, which would march south to confront Robert E. Lee's legendary Army of Northern Virginia. This wasn't just about capturing Richmond, the Confederate capital. Grant's primary objective was the destruction of Lee's army. He famously said, "Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also." He aimed to pin Lee down, grind his forces through constant combat, and bleed the Confederacy's most formidable fighting force dry. Simultaneously, in the West, Grant ordered General William Tecumseh Sherman to move his massive army group out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Sherman's mission was twofold: destroy the Confederate Army of Tennessee, led by General Joseph E. Johnston, and wrecked the state of Georgia's economic and logistical infrastructure, which was vital to the entire Confederate war effort. This would become the famous Atlanta campaign, but it didn't stop there. Other, smaller Union forces were also put in motion. General Francis Gould was tasked with advancing up the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, a crucial agricultural region known as the breadbasket of the Confederacy. Its fertile fields supplied Lee's army, and controlling it would tighten the logistical noose. In another supporting move, General Benjamin Butler was to lead his army up the James River toward Richmond from the southeast, threatening the Confederate capital from a different direction and troops that might otherwise reinforce Lee. The concept was simple but brutal. Relentless pressure. Everywhere. All at once. Grant understood the grim arithmetic of the war. The Union had a significant advantage in manpower and material. It could replace its losses, both in men and supplies, far more easily than the Confederacy could. So, by forcing constant engagement, he was deliberately turning the war into a contest of attrition, a contest the South was mathematically destined to lose. This strategy marked the beginning of what we now call total war. It wasn't just about armies fighting armies on a battlefield anymore. It was about crippling the enemy's ability and will to continue the fight by targeting its economy, its infrastructure, and its morale. Grant wasn't just fighting soldiers. He was fighting a whole society's capacity to wage war. When the campaign kicked off in May 1864, the results were immediate and horrific. The Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan River and plunged into a dense, tangled forest known as the Wilderness. What followed was 2 days of hellish, close-quarters combat. The woods caught fire, and wounded soldiers from both sides were tragically burned alive. It was a confusing, brutal, and nightmarish battle. The Union suffered heavier casualties than the Confederates. By the old rules of war, this would have been considered a tactical defeat for the Union. The Army would have been expected to retreat north, lick its wounds, and try again later. But this was Grant's war, and the old rules no longer applied. After the savage fighting in the Wilderness, instead of ordering a retreat, Grant gave a simple but profound order. March south. As the Union columns reached a key intersection, they turned not north, back toward Washington, but south, continuing their push toward Richmond. When the veteran soldiers realized what was happening, they erupted in cheers. They finally had a general who wouldn't quit. A general who was determined to see this through to the end. This single moment signaled to everyone, friend and foe alike, that the war had entered its final, most ruthless phase. The very next engagement happened just a few days later at Appomattox Court House. For nearly 2 weeks, the two armies engaged in some of the most ferocious fighting of the entire war. The struggle centered on a Confederate defensive salient known as the Mule Shoe. The fighting at one particular point, which became known as the Bloody Angle, lasted for nearly 24 hours of non-stop, hand-to-hand combat, often fought in torrential rain and thick mud. Men fought with bayonets, clubbed muskets, and even their bare fists. It was pure butchery. Again, Union casualties were staggering. But Grant was relentless. He wasn't winning every battle in the traditional sense, but he was accomplishing his strategic goal. He was forcing Lee to fight continuously, draining his manpower, and using up his dwindling supplies. After Spotsylvania, Grant again maneuvered south, always trying to get between Lee's army and Richmond. He was like a bulldog who had clamped his jaws on his opponent and simply refused to let go. This bloody series of battles continued at North Anna and then at Cold Harbor. The assault at Cold Harbor, in particular, became a symbol of the campaign's terrible cost. In a frontal attack against well-entrenched Confederate positions, the Union Army lost nearly 7,000 men in less than an hour. It was a slaughter, and even Grant later admitted that he regretted ordering that attack. The soldiers in the Union Army knew the odds. Before the assault, many were seen pinning pieces of paper with their names and addresses to their uniforms, so their bodies could be identified later. In just over a month, from the Wilderness to Cold Harbor, Grant's army had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, a number roughly equivalent to the entire size of Lee's army at the start of the campaign. The Northern public was horrified by the casualty lists, and newspapers began labeling Grant a butcher. Many questioned if this relentless pressure was worth the horrific cost in human life. But what those critics often missed was the other side of the equation. Lee's army, though brilliantly led and fighting tenaciously on the defensive, was also being systematically destroyed. It had lost over 30,000 men, a much higher percentage of its total strength, and these were veteran soldiers the Confederacy simply could not replace. Their morale, while still strong, was beginning to fray under the constant strain. They were always marching, always digging, always fighting. There was no respite. Grant's strategy was brutal. It was costly, but it was working. He had successfully pinned Lee's army down and was bleeding it white, unable to break through Lee's defenses directly to capture Richmond. Grant made another brilliant strategic pivot. He disengaged from Lee at Cold Harbor, skillfully moved his massive army south across the James River. Major logistical feat targeted the crucial railroad hub of Petersburg, just south of Richmond. If Petersburg fell, all the supply lines to Richmond and Lee's army would be cut. The Confederate capital would be indefensible. This move caught Lee by surprise and initiated the siege of Petersburg, a grueling 9-month struggle of trench warfare that would foreshadow the Western Front of World War I. Meanwhile, Grant's other offensives were also applying pressure. While Sigal's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley initially failed, Grant replaced him with the aggressive General Philip Sheridan, who would later wage a devastating campaign to crush Confederate resistance there. And far to the south, Sherman's army was grinding its way toward Atlanta, facing down Johnston's skillful defensive retreats. Every part of the Confederacy was feeling the squeeze. Grant's relentless pressure in 1864 fundamentally changed the American Civil War. It transformed it from a series of disconnected battles into a singular, all-encompassing struggle of attrition and total war. His willingness to accept enormous casualties in pursuit of his strategic objective was controversial then and remains so today. But there is no denying its effectiveness. By the end of 1864, the Confederacy was reeling on all fronts, its armies depleted, its infrastructure shattered, and its hopes for victory fading fast. The butcher's bill was high, but Grant's grim arithmetic was leading the Union toward the inevitable end. Thanks for watching. In our next chapter, we'll follow Sherman's march to the sea and the final collapse of the Confederacy. If you found this video informative, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next part of our story. See you next time. By early 1865, the situation for the Confederacy was beyond dire. For General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, it was the ultimate test of leadership. His legendary army, once the terror of the Union, was now a shadow of its former self, trapped in the grueling siege of Petersburg and Richmond. This wasn't just a military challenge. It was a profound human drama, and Lee stood at its very center. For 9 long months, his men had held a sprawling 37-mile line of trenches against a relentlessly growing Union force. But the cost was staggering. The once proud soldiers were now starving, their uniforms reduced to rags. One soldier wrote home, saying his daily ration was just a handful of cornmeal, often uncooked. Another described how the men were so weak they could barely lift their rifles. Desertion, once unthinkable in this disciplined army, became a nightly crisis. Men who had fought bravely at Gettysburg and Chancellorsville were now slipping away into the darkness, driven by desperation and letters from home pleading for their return to starving families. Through it all, Lee remained the unshakable heart of the army. He was a constant presence along the lines, his iconic gray horse, Traveler, a familiar sight to the weary soldiers. He shared their hardships, often sleeping on the ground with only a thin blanket. His own meals were as meager as theirs. There's a famous story of a staff officer inviting Lee to a fine dinner, only for Lee to politely refuse, saying he couldn't feast while his men went hungry. This wasn't for show. It was the core of his leadership. He believed a commander's duty was to suffer alongside his troops. His men saw this, and it inspired a loyalty that defied logic. They revered him, calling him Marseille Robert. For many, they weren't fighting for the Confederacy anymore. They were fighting for him. But personal charisma couldn't conjure food or ammunition. The Confederate supply system had completely collapsed. Railroads were torn up, depots were empty, and the government in Richmond seemed Lee sent a stream of increasingly urgent messages, bordering on desperate, pleading for supplies. He wrote, "The men are barefoot. They are freezing. They are starving. If we cannot feed our soldiers, the cause is lost." His words were stark and prophetic. He knew the breaking point was near. Strategically, Lee was in an impossible position, a trap he had foreseen but was powerless to escape. He was pinned against Richmond, the Confederate capital. To abandon the trenches meant abandoning the capital, a move that would shatter what little remained of Confederate morale and political legitimacy. But to stay meant slow, inevitable starvation and annihilation. General Ulysses S. Grant, his Union counterpart, understood this perfectly. Grant wasn't just fighting a battle, he was waging a war of attrition, a grim mathematical equation Lee could not win. Grant's army was well-fed, well-equipped, and constantly reinforced. For every Union soldier lost, another 2 arrived. For every Confederate soldier who fell or deserted, there was no one to take his place. Lee, the master of the audacious offensive, was forced to fight a purely defensive war. His strategic genius was shackled. He spent his days poring over maps, trying to find a weakness, a sliver of an opportunity to strike back. He considered desperate plans, like a last-ditch breakout to the south to link up with General Johnston's forces in North Carolina. It was a long shot, a gamble that required his starving army to outmarch and outfight Grant's well-fed legions. As winter turned to a bleak spring, the end drew closer. On April 1st, the Union Army achieved a decisive breakthrough at the Battle of Five Forks, a critical crossroads southwest of Petersburg. The Confederate line was shattered. Lee's right flank was gone. When the news reached him, the famously stoic general showed a rare flash of anger, but it quickly gave way to a grim resignation. The time for holding the trenches was over. That night, under the cover of darkness, Lee gave the order he had dreaded for months. Evacuate Petersburg and Richmond. The retreat was chaotic. Fires raged in the capital as Confederate forces destroyed supplies to keep them from falling into Union hands. The retreat itself was a desperate flight. Lee's plan was to march west, hoping to get his army to a supply depot at Amelia Court House and then turn south. But the promised rations weren't there. A catastrophic administrative blunder had sent ammunition instead of food. The discovery was a devastating blow. The starving army had marched for nothing. Now, the retreat became a race against death. Union cavalry, led by the relentless Philip Sheridan, harried their flanks, snapping up stragglers and cutting off their path. Lee's army began to disintegrate. At Sailor's Creek on April 6th, nearly a quarter of Lee's remaining army was cut off and captured. Watching the disaster unfold from a nearby ridge, Lee was heard to exclaim, "My God! Has the army been dissolved?" It was a moment of pure agony for a commander who loved his men like sons. Yet, even then, he refused to give up completely. He pushed the remnants of his army onward, a small, starving band of diehards. His subordinate officers began to press him, telling him the cause was hopeless, and further resistance would only lead to more needless death. Lee listened, his face a mask of exhaustion and sorrow. He still felt a powerful sense of duty to his country and to the men who had sacrificed everything. The idea of surrender was abhorrent to him, but finally, reality became undeniable. Trapped at a small village called Appomattox Court House, with Grant's army surrounding him on 3 sides and Sheridan's cavalry blocking his only escape route, the fight was over. Lee looked at his tiny, exhausted force, no more than 8,000 armed men, and knew the moment had come. He famously said, "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." In those final, impossible months, Robert E. Lee showed a different kind of greatness. It wasn't the brilliance of a stunning victory, but the profound character of a leader facing certain defeat. He held his army together through sheer force of will and a deep, personal connection to his men. He wrestled with an unwinnable strategic dilemma, trying to balance military necessity with his duty to his soldiers. In the end, his most difficult and perhaps his greatest act of command was recognizing when it was time to stop the fighting and spare his men from further slaughter. His leadership in this final chapter was not about winning a war, but about how a leader behaves when all is lost. Thank you for watching. If you found this chapter of history compelling, please consider subscribing to our channel for more deep dives into the past. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the American Civil War. Today, we're rediving into one of the longest and most consequential campaigns of the entire conflict, the Siege of Petersburg. Forget what you might imagine about a traditional medieval siege with towering walls. This was something different, a brutal, 9.5 month struggle of attrition that would ultimately decide the fate of the Confederacy. It's June 1864. General Ulysses S. leading the Union armies, had been relentlessly pushing Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia south since the spring. After the bloody battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, Grant realized that a direct assault on the heavily fortified Confederate capital of Richmond was too costly. He needed a new strategy. His eyes turned to a city just 23 miles south of Richmond, Petersburg. Why Petersburg? It was the logistical heart of the Confederacy. 5 major railroad lines converged there, supplying Richmond and Lee's army with food, ammunition, and reinforcements from across the South. Grant understood a simple, brutal truth. If he could capture Petersburg, he could cut off Richmond's lifeline. The Confederate capital would wither and die, and Lee's army would be forced to abandon its defenses. So, instead of another frontal attack, Grant decided to lay siege. The initial Union assaults on Petersburg from June 15th to 18th were poorly coordinated and ultimately failed to break the Confederate lines, despite some initial successes. The Confederates, though outnumbered, quickly dug in, creating a vast and complex network of trenches, forts, and earthworks that would eventually stretch for over 30 miles. This set the stage for a long, drawn-out war of position. The conflict transformed from open-field battles into a grim, modern form of trench warfare, a terrifying preview of what was to come in World War I a half-century later. Life in the trenches was hell on earth for the soldiers of both sides. They faced constant danger not just from enemy fire, but also from disease, exposure, and the sheer psychological strain of confinement. The summer sun beat down relentlessly, turning the trenches into dusty, sweltering pits. In winter, freezing rain and mud made conditions even more miserable. Snipers were a constant threat, picking off anyone who carelessly showed their head. Artillery duels were a daily occurrence, a terrifying lottery where death could rain down from the sky at any moment. One of the most infamous and dramatic events of the siege was the Battle of the Crater, on July 30th, 1864. Union troops, many of them former coal miners from Pennsylvania, spent weeks digging a 500-foot-long tunnel under a Confederate fort. They packed it with 4 tons of gunpowder. The plan was to detonate the mine, blow a massive hole in the Confederate defenses, and pour troops through the gap to break the stalemate. At dawn, the mine exploded in a spectacular, horrifying blast. Earth, cannons, and men were thrown hundreds of feet into the air, leaving a massive crater in the ground. But what should have been a decisive breakthrough turned into a catastrophic failure. The Union attack that followed was disorganized. Instead of going around the crater, the lead troops charged directly into it, getting trapped in the loose soil and steep sides. The Confederates, initially stunned, quickly regrouped. They surrounded the crater and poured a devastating fire down on the trapped Union soldiers, turning the pit into a slaughterhouse. The Battle of the Crater was a tactical disaster for the Union and a particularly brutal episode in an already brutal campaign. Despite setbacks like the crater, Grant's overall strategy was working. Slowly but surely, he wasn't just sitting still. Throughout the summer and fall of 1864, he launched a series of offensives aimed at extending his lines westward. This was the Anaconda Plan in miniature. Push, he forced Lee to stretch his own defensive lines thinner and thinner. Lee's army was already depleted and struggling for supplies, and he simply didn't have enough men to cover the expanding front. These flanking movements were a constant grind. Battles like Globe Tavern, Reams Station, and Peebles Farm weren't massive, decisive clashes, but they each served a purpose. With every battle, the Union Army captured another piece of a vital railroad or a key crossroads. They were slowly, methodically, severing Petersburg's arteries. The Weldon Railroad, a critical supply line from North Carolina, was cut in August. By October, the Union was threatening the South Side Railroad, the last remaining rail link into the city. The siege also had a profound impact on the home front and the political landscape. The seemingly endless stalemate and the mounting casualty lists in the summer of 1864 caused morale in the North to plummet. President Abraham Lincoln faced a tough re-election campaign, with many calling for a negotiated peace. But then, news of other Union victories, like Sherman's capture of Atlanta, began to turn the tide of public opinion. People started to see that Grant's strategy of attrition, while costly, was inexorably grinding the Confederacy down. As the siege dragged into the winter of 1864 to 1865, conditions for the Confederates became desperate. Food was scarce. Soldiers were ragged, hungry, and exhausted. Desertions became a major problem as men lost hope and worried about their families back home. The Confederate supply system, already strained, was collapsing under the pressure of Grant's relentless campaign. The vibrant city of Petersburg itself was shelled into ruins, its civilians enduring constant hardship and fear. Meanwhile, the Union Army, though also suffering, was well. The massive logistical base at City Point, on the James River, became a bustling port city. Ships arrived daily with food, ammunition, and fresh troops. This stark contrast in logistics was the key to the siege. Grant could replace his losses and sustain his army indefinitely. Lee could not. The final act began in the spring of 1865. Grant, now reinforced and ready, saw his opportunity. On April 1st, at the Battle of Five Forks, Union forces under General Philip Sheridan smashed the far right flank of Lee's army, seizing the crucial crossroads that protected the South Side Railroad. This victory was the final nail in the coffin. The last supply line to Petersburg was gone. With his lines broken and his position untenable, Lee knew the end had come. On the night of April 2nd, he ordered the evacuation of both Petersburg and Richmond. After 292 days of brutal, relentless siege, the Confederate defenses crumbled. The next morning, Union troops marched into the smoking ruins of both cities. The Confederate government had fled, and the capital had fallen. Lee's once proud army was now in a desperate race for survival, trying to escape west to link up with other Confederate forces. But it was too late. Grant's army was in hot pursuit. The siege of Petersburg had successfully destroyed the logistical foundation of the Confederacy in Virginia and forced its premier army out into the open, where it could be finally defeated. Just 1 week later, on April 9th, 1865, Robert E. Lee would surrender to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Court House, effectively ending the Civil War. The siege of Petersburg was a testament to endurance, innovation, and the grim realities of modern warfare. It was here that the Confederacy's ability to wage war was slowly and systematically strengthened. It wasn't a single, glorious battle, but a long, painful, and decisive campaign that brought the nation's bloodiest conflict to its conclusion. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the Civil War. We'll see you in the next video. Welcome back to our series on the final days of the Civil War. In this episode, Chapter 6, we're diving into the dramatic and pivotal moment when the Confederate capital, Richmond, found itself teetering on the brink of collapse. The key to understanding Richmond's fate lies just 23 miles to its south, in a city called Petersburg. For 10 long months, Petersburg had been the linchpin of the Confederate defense, a stubborn bastion holding back the full might of the Union Army. Why was it so important? Because Petersburg was the supply hub for Richmond. 5 crucial railroads converged there, carrying food, ammunition, and reinforcements to both the city and General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. As long as Petersburg held, Richmond could survive. General Ulysses S. Grant understood this simple, brutal equation. He famously said that the best way to capture Richmond was not to attack it directly, but to sever its lifeline at Petersburg. So, for nearly a year, from June 1864 to April 1865, the two armies were locked in a grueling stalemate of trench warfare, a brutal preview of what was to come in World War I. The lines of trenches stretched for miles, a maze of earthworks, forts, and artillery batteries. Life in these trenches was a miserable existence of constant danger, disease, and deprivation. Soldiers on both sides endured scorching heat, freezing cold, and the relentless stress of sniper fire and artillery bombardments. The siege was a slow, grinding affair. Grant's strategy was one of attrition. He knew he had more men and more resources than Lee. He could afford to extend his lines, forcing Lee to stretch his own thinning ranks to the breaking point. It was a war of logistics, of endurance, and of sheer numbers. Every Union attack, even if repulsed, costly men he could not replace. Every new section of Union trench put more pressure on the Confederate supply lines. The breaking point finally came on April 1st, 1865, at the Battle of Five Forks. This was a critical crossroads southwest of Petersburg. Grant sent General Philip Sheridan with a powerful force of infantry and cavalry to seize it. A victory here would cut the last remaining railroad into Petersburg, the South Side Railroad. Lee, recognizing the immense danger, dispatched General George Pickett to defend the position. But Pickett's forces were outnumbered and exhausted. In a swift and decisive attack, Sheridan's troops overwhelmed the Confederates, shattering their line and capturing thousands of prisoners. The loss of Five Forks was a catastrophic blow. The back door to Petersburg was now wide open. The next morning, at dawn on April 2nd, Grant ordered a massive general assault all along the Petersburg lines. The Union soldiers, sensing that the end was near, surged forward with renewed determination. The thinly manned Confederate defenses, stretched to their absolute limit, began to crumble. One by one, key forts and redoubts that had defied capture for months were overrun. The fighting was desperate and bloody. Confederate General Appomattox, one of Lee's most trusted corps commanders, was killed while trying to rally his men. His death was a symbolic blow, signaling the collapse of the Army's command structure and morale. By mid-morning, Union troops had broken through in multiple places. The Confederate lines were no longer a coherent defensive system, but a series of isolated, desperate pockets of resistance. With his defenses shattered and the Union Army pouring through the gaps, General Lee had no choice. He sent a telegram to the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, in Richmond. The message was stark and unambiguous. "I see no prospect of doing more than holding our position here till night. I am not certain I can do that. I advise that all preparation be made for leaving Richmond tonight." That telegram arrived in Richmond on a quiet Sunday morning. President Davis was attending services at St. Paul's Episcopal Church when a sexton walked quietly down the aisle and handed him the note. Davies read it, his face pale but composed, and quickly left the church. The news spread through the pews like a shockwave, then out into the streets of the city. What began as a whisper soon grew into a panicked roar. The government that had defiantly presided over the Confederacy for 4 years was now packing its bags. Panic gripped the capital. The domino effect that Grant had engineered was now in full motion. The fall of Petersburg meant the inevitable fall of Richmond. The two cities were so strategically intertwined that the fate of one was the fate of the other. The government began a frantic evacuation. Wagons were hastily loaded with official records, the Confederate treasury, and personal belongings. The train depot became a scene of chaos as officials and their families scrambled to get on the last trains heading south. The city's defenses were ordered to be abandoned. The soldiers who had guarded the capital for so long were now pulling back, joining the retreat of Lee's army. But the evacuation was not just a government affair. As authority broke down, chaos took over. The city's commissaries were thrown open, and starving residents flooded in to take whatever food they could find. This soon devolved into widespread looting. As night fell on April 2nd, a new horror unfolded. On the orders of the retreating Confederate military, the city's warehouses, full of tobacco, cotton, and munitions, were set on fire. The logic was to deny these valuable resources to the advancing Union Army. But the decision was disastrous. The fires quickly spread out of control, whipped by strong winds. The city's fire brigades were overwhelmed. Soon, the entire business district was ablaze. The explosions from the armory and ordnance depots rocked the city, sending shells and shrapnel flying through the air. The night sky glowed a terrifying orange as Richmond, the proud capital of the Confederacy, consumed itself in flames. The scene was apocalyptic. The fires raged through the night and into the next day. By the morning of April 3rd, large parts of the city lay in smoldering ruins. The bridges over the James River had been burned, cutting off the main escape route. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of destruction. It was into this scene of devastation that the first Union soldiers entered. They were members of the United States colored troops, who marched into the city to find it surrendered by the mayor. Their entry was powerfully symbolic. The very men whom the Confederacy had fought to keep in bondage were now marching as liberators into its fallen capital. They helped to restore order, put out the remaining fires, and distribute food to the hungry population, both black and white. The fall of Petersburg had not just led to the fall of Richmond. It had triggered a complete and utter collapse of Confederate authority. In less than 24 hours, a 10-month siege had culminated in the loss of the Confederacy's industrial heart its primary army's supply base, and its national capital. The dominoes had fallen, one after another, with stunning speed. For Robert E. Lee and the remnants of his once invincible army, the only option left was to retreat west, hoping to link up with other Confederate forces in North Carolina. But with Grant's army in hot pursuit, their time was running out. The final chapter of the war was about to be written. The story of Richmond's fall is a dramatic testament to the strategic importance of logistics in warfare. It shows how a long, patient siege, combined with a decisive flanking maneuver, could unravel an entire defensive network and bring a capital to its knees. The domino effect was not just a military phenomenon, it was a psychological one. The news of Petersburg's fall broke the will of Richmond's defenders and its government, leading to a cascade of chaos, fire, and surrender. 2 days later, on April 4th, President Abraham Lincoln himself visited the captured city. He walked through the streets, largely to the Confederate White House, the former home of Jefferson Davis. He sat in Davis's chair, a quiet, powerful symbol of the Union's ultimate victory. For the people of Richmond, and for the entire nation, the war was finally, truly coming to an end. The fall of the capital marked the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. But the road to reunion would be long and difficult, a challenge that would test the nation in new and profound ways. Thank you for joining us for this chapter. The story is far from over. In our next episode, we'll follow Lee's desperate retreat from Petersburg and the final, dramatic chase that leads to Appomattox Court House. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching. Welcome back to our series on the final days of the Confederacy. Today, we're in Chapter 7, focusing on a pivotal, heart-wrenching moment. The evacuation of Richmond. For 4 long years, Richmond, Virginia, wasn't just a city. It was the political, industrial, and emotional heart of the Confederate States of America. It symbolized the rebellion's strength and defiance. But by April 1865, that symbol was about to shatter. The Union armies, relentless and overwhelming, were closing in. The defensive lines around Petersburg, the key to Richmond's survival, had finally broken. The news hit the Confederate capital like a shockwave. It was a quiet Sunday morning, April 2nd, 1865. President Jefferson Davis was attending services at St. Paul's Episcopal Church, a routine he'd maintained throughout the war. But this Sunday was different. A sexton walked silently down the aisle and handed him a telegram. It was from General Robert E. Lee. The message was stark and unambiguous. "I advise that all preparation be made for leaving Richmond tonight." Lee's lines had collapsed. The city could no longer be defended. The government had to flee. Imagine the scene. Davis's face, pale but composed, quietly rose and left the church. His departure sent a ripple of unease through the congregation. Soon, the news began to spread like wildfire, first in whispers, then in panicked shouts. The Confederate government, the institution that had guided the South through years of brutal conflict, was abandoning its capital. For the residents of Richmond, this wasn't just a military retreat. It was the end of their world. The city had endured so much sieges, shortages, the constant threat of attack. Its people had sacrificed everything, believing in their cause and their leaders. Now, that belief was crumbling into dust. The decision to evacuate was a logistical and emotional nightmare. Government officials scrambled to pack essential documents, trying to save the Confederate archives from falling into enemy hands. They loaded papers, treasury notes, and the nation's gold reserves onto a train, a government on wheels destined for Danville, Virginia, with the hope of establishing a new capital there. But this was no orderly withdrawal. Chaos was taking hold. As evening fell, the city descended into a state of near. The government's plan to destroy all military supplies, tobacco, and anything of value to the advancing Union army went horribly wrong. On their orders, Confederate soldiers set fire to the warehouses lining the James River. But the winds were high that night. Sparks and embers flew through the air, igniting nearby buildings. The fires quickly spun out of control, consuming block after block of the city's business district. The flames, meant to be a final act of defiance, turned into a self-inflicted wound, a funeral pyre for the Confederate dream. The night sky glowed an apocalyptic orange, reflecting in the waters of the James River. The air filled with the roar of the fire, the crash of collapsing buildings, and the frantic shouts of people trying to save their homes and belongings. Amid this inferno, the evacuation began. The roads leading out of Richmond were choked with a desperate procession. Government officials in their carriages, soldiers on foot, and ordinary citizens with whatever they could carry fled into the night. It was a scene of profound sorrow and desperation. Women wept openly in the streets, watching their homes burn and their world dissolve. The city that had once been a beacon of Southern pride was now a scene of utter devastation. Varina Davis, the First Lady, had already left days earlier, a painful precursor to the final departure. Her farewell to her husband was a poignant moment, a personal tragedy mirroring the larger collapse of their nation. She described the feeling of leaving the city as leaving a home filled with the ghosts of hope and happiness. The emotional toll on those who remained was immense. They had lived with the constant drumbeat of war for 4 years, and now, the end was coming not with a final glorious battle, but with fire, chaos, and abandonment. The social order completely broke down. With the government gone and the military in retreat, mobs began to form. People broke into stores and warehouses, grabbing food, liquor, and anything they could find. The city's saloons were emptied, and drunken crowds added to the mayhem. The fires, the looting, the explosions from the armoriette was a vision of hell on earth. For the enslaved African Americans in the city, however, this chaos signaled something entirely different. It was the sound of freedom approaching. As the Confederate flags were lowered and the authorities fled, the promise of liberation, so long deferred, was finally at hand. As dawn broke on April 3rd, the first Union soldiers, including units of United States colored troops, marched into the smoldering ruins of Richmond. They were met not with resistance, but with a surreal landscape of destruction and a population dazed and defeated. The Union soldiers worked to extinguish the fires and restore order, but the damage was done. The heart of the Confederacy had not just been captured, it had been gutted, partly by its own defenders. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. The fall of Richmond was more than a military victory for the Union. It was the definitive end of the Confederacy's claim to be a viable, functioning nation. Without its capital, its industrial center, and its primary symbol, the rebellion was effectively over. Just 1 day later, on April 4th, an even more powerful scene unfolded. President Abraham Lincoln, who had been nearby at the Union front, traveled up the James River and walked through the streets of the conquered city. It was an extraordinary moment. With only a small guard, the President of the United States walked through the capital of the rebellion. He was immediately surrounded by freed African Americans, who greeted him with tears, prayers, and songs of praise. They saw him as their Moses, the man who had led them out of bondage. For them, the ashes of Richmond were the birthplace of a new life of freedom. Lincoln's visit was a quiet, solemn act, not one of triumph, but of a leader contemplating the immense cost of the war and the difficult path of reconciliation that lay ahead. The evacuation of Richmond marked the end of an era, the city that had been the epicenter of the Confederate war effort. The place where policies were made and armies were supplied was now a conquered ruin. Its government was in flight. Its great general was on the verge of surrender, and its dream of an independent nation had turned to smoke and ash. The emotional departure of its leaders and the fiery destruction that followed served as a dramatic and tragic final act for the capital of the lost cause. The heart of the Confederacy had stopped beating, and with it, the war itself was drawing to its inevitable conclusion. Thank you for watching. Please join us next time as we follow the final, desperate days of the fleeing Confederate government and Lee's army on the road to Appomattox. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next chapter. Welcome back to our series on the final days of the American Civil War. In this chapter, we turn our attention to the desperate, grueling journey known as the Long Retreat West. The date is April 2nd, 1865. The Confederate lines at Petersburg have finally broken after a brutal, months-long siege. Richmond, the heart and capital of the Confederacy, has fallen. For General Robert E. Lee and the once mighty Army of Northern Virginia, the situation is dire. Their only hope for survival is to escape the closing jaws of the Union Army. The plan was a desperate gamble, a race against time and starvation. Lee's objective was to march his army west, covering dozens of miles as quickly as possible. He aimed to reach key railway junctions like Danville or Lynchburg. Why there? Because these towns held the promise of food, ammunition, and medical supplies resources his men desperately needed. If they could get resupplied, they might have a chance. An even more ambitious hope was to link up with General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate Army, which was still operating in North Carolina. A combined force could potentially turn the tide, or at least prolong the fight and negotiate better terms of surrender. But this was a long shot, and everyone, from Lee down to the lowest private, knew it. The retreat began under the cover of darkness, a chaotic and somber exodus from the trenches they had defended for so long. The men were exhausted, not just from the final battle, but from nearly a year of trench warfare, poor rations, and constant stress. They were a shadow of their former selves. Many were shoeless, their uniforms tattered rags. Their faces were gaunt from hunger, their bodies weakened by disease and fatigue. Yet their loyalty to Lee and their cause propelled them onward. They marched through the night, the glow of a burning Richmond lighting up the sky behind them, a fiery and tragic farewell to their capital. The army was not a single, cohesive unit, but a long, stretched-out column of men, wagons, and artillery. Snaking its way across the Virginia countryside, the retreat was immediately plagued by problems. The roads were muddy and difficult, slowing their pace. The supply wagons, crucial for their survival, struggled to keep up. Confusion reigned as different units took different routes, sometimes getting lost in the dark. The command structure, once so efficient, began to fray under the immense pressure. Orders were delayed or misinterpreted. It was a retreat born of desperation, and it so ate. From the very beginning, General Ulysses S. Grant and the Union Army were in hot pursuit. Grant was a relentless and determined commander. He understood that this was his moment to end the war. He wasn't just chasing Lee. He was actively trying to get ahead of him, to cut off his escape routes. Union cavalry, led by the aggressive General Philip Sheridan, became the tip of the spear. Sheridan's horsemen were fresh and well-fed. They relentlessly harassed the Confederate column, striking at its flanks, capturing wagons, and picking off stragglers. Every skirmish, no matter how small, further depleted Lee's dwindling numbers and sapped his army's morale. One of the first major blows came at a place called Appomattox Court House. Lee had ordered rations to be sent there from Richmond, expecting to find a train full of food waiting for his starving army. When they arrived on April 4th, their hearts sank. There were trains, yes, but they were filled with ammunition and supplies, not the desperately needed food. A logistical blunder of catastrophic proportions had occurred. The food had been sent to Richmond for the fleeing government officials instead. This was a devastating setback. The army had to halt for a precious day to forage for food in the surrounding countryside, but the area was already picked clean. This halt gave Grant's pursuing forces a golden opportunity to close the gap. The race was on, and Lee was losing. The next few days became a running battle, a series of desperate stands and frantic march. The men were now subsisting on whatever they could find: a handful of parched corn, a few green shoots from the side of the road. Starvation was a constant companion. Men fell out of the ranks, too weak to continue. The sight of abandoned cannons and burning wagons littered the route, a testament to the army's disintegration. Morale, once sky high, was plummeting. The soldiers could see the end was near. They were being hunted, cornered with nowhere to run. A significant engagement took place at Sailor's Creek on April 6th. Here, Sheridan's cavalry and elements of the Union infantry managed to cut off and surround a large portion of the Confederate rearguard, about a quarter of Lee's remaining army. The fighting was fierce and desperate. The Confederates, though outnumbered and exhausted, fought with the courage of cornered animals. But it was a hopeless struggle. Thousands were captured, including 8 generals. When Lee witnessed the disaster from a nearby ridge, he was heard to say, "My God, has the army been dissolved?" It was a moment that brought the reality of their situation into sharp focus. The Army of Northern Virginia was being destroyed piece by piece. After the disaster at Sailor's Creek, the retreat became even more desperate. The remaining soldiers pushed on, driven by sheer will and loyalty to their commander. They were heading for Farmville, where they hoped to get rations from supply trains that had managed to get through. They did find some food there, but their respite was short-lived. Union forces were right on their heels, forcing them to abandon the town and continue their westward flight. They crossed the Appomattox River, burning the bridges behind them to slow the Union pursuit, but it was only a temporary delay. By April 8th, the remnants of Lee's army were exhausted, starving, and nearly surrounded. They had marched over 100 miles in less than a week, with almost no food and constant fighting. Union forces had successfully blocked their path to Lynchburg. Lee's last hope was to break through the Union lines at a small village called Appomattox Court House. He planned one final, desperate attack for the morning of April 9th, hoping to punch a hole through what he thought was a thin line of Union cavalry and escape into the mountains. But it was not to be. When the sun rose on that fateful morning, the Confederate soldiers pushed forward, only to find that behind the cavalry screen was a massive force of Union infantry, arrayed in lines of battle. The trap was sprung. The Army of Northern Virginia was completely surrounded. There was nowhere left to go. The long, agonizing retreat was over. Faced with the utter futility of further resistance and the certainty of more bloodshed, Lee knew he had no choice. The decision he made next would end the bloodiest chapter in American history and begin the long, difficult process of healing a fractured nation. Join us next time as we cover the final moments at Appomattox Court House. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more. The end was near. On April 2nd, 1865, after a grueling 10-month siege, the Confederate lines at Petersburg finally broke. That night, under the cover of darkness, Robert E. Lee's legendary Army of Northern Virginia abandoned their trenches and slipped away. Their capital, Richmond, just a few miles north, was evacuated and left to burn. For the soldiers in blue, the sight of the empty Confederate works and the distant glow of a burning city was electrifying. After 4 long years of bloody conflict, victory felt tantalizingly close. But Ulysses S. Grant knew this was no time for celebration. A cornered animal is at its most dangerous, and Lee's army, though battered and starving, was still a formidable force. The war wasn't over until that army was captured or destroyed. Grant's only thought was pursuit. He immediately set his massive Union war machine in motion, determined to give the Confederates no rest, no time to regroup, no chance to escape. Lee's objective was clear. He had to get his army south, fast. His plan was to march west, bypassing the bulk of Grant's forces, and reach a supply depot at Amelia Court House, about 40 miles away. There, he expected to find rations and supplies waiting for his hungry troops. From there, he would turn south and link up with General Joseph E. Johnston's Confederate Army in North Carolina. Combined, they might be able to turn the tide, or at least prolong the fight. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only one he had. The race to Amelia Court House was on. As Lee's men began their weary march, they were already on the brink of exhaustion. Many hadn't eaten a full meal in days. Their uniforms were ragged, their shoes were worn through, and their spirits, once unbreakable, were beginning to crack under the weight of hunger and defeat. Yet, they marched on, driven by loyalty to their commander and a faint, flickering hope of survival. Grant, however, was a master of logistics and relentless pressure. He didn't just follow Lee, he anticipated him. He understood that the key to victory was to outpace the Confederates, to cut them off from their supplies and their escape routes. He immediately dispatched his cavalry, led by the aggressive and brilliant Philip Sheridan, to ride hard and fast along a parallel route south of Lee's line of march. Sheridan's mission was to harass the Confederate column, strike their wagon trains, and, most importantly, get ahead of them to block their path. Meanwhile, Grant's infantry corps, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James, would press directly on Lee's rear and flank. He divided his forces, sending them on different roads, all converging on Lee's army like the closing jaws of a vice. Grant's orders were simple and brutal. March, march, march. Union soldiers, buoyed by the prospect of final victory, pushed themselves to their physical limits, covering incredible distances day and night. When Lee's exhausted vanguard reached Amelia Court House on April 4th, they were met with a devastating blow. The expected train of rations was not there. Through a disastrous mix-up in communication, the supply train had been sent straight through to Richmond without unloading the food, and was subsequently captured or destroyed during the city's evacuation. The cupboards were bare. Lee's gamble had failed. The soldiers, who had marched for 2 days with nothing but the promise of food to sustain them, were met with crushing disappointment. This was a critical turning point. Precious time was now lost as Lee was forced to send out foraging parties into the surrounding countryside to scrounge for whatever food they could find. The delay was fatal. It gave Grant S. pursuing columns exactly the time they needed to close in. The brief head start Lee had gained was gone. While Lee's men scoured the countryside for scraps, Sheridan's cavalry was not idle. On April 5th, near a small crossroads called Jetersville, just a few miles south of Amelia, Sheridan's troopers arrived and began digging in, squarely on the railroad line Lee's intended path south. They were soon reinforced by the lead elements of the Union infantry. Lee was now blocked. When he discovered the Union force entrenched in his path, he knew a frontal assault was suicidal for his weakened army. He had no choice but to turn west again, hoping to find another route south. The detour cost him more time, more energy, and pushed his men further down the road to starvation. The Union pursuit was no longer just a chase. It was a stranglehold, tightening with every passing hour. The next day, April 6, the Ache would become known as the Black Day of the Army of Northern Virginia. As Lee's army snaked its way west, its long, stretched-out column became vulnerable. Near a stream called Sailor's Creek, the Confederate rearguard, which included a large portion of their remaining wagon train and the corps of Generals Richard Ewell and Richard Anderson, became separated from the main body of the army. Union cavalry swooped in, attacking the wagons and creating chaos. Simultaneously, Union infantry slammed into the isolated Confederate divisions from multiple directions. The battle was a disaster for the Confederates. Trapped and overwhelmed, they fought bravely, but were ultimately overrun. By the end of the day, nearly 8,000 Confederate soldiers, including 6 generals, were recaptured. It was a staggering blow, representing roughly a quarter of Lee's remaining army. When Lee witnessed the shattered remnants of his forces streaming back from the fight, he exclaimed in anguish, "My God, has the army been dissolved?" The pursuit was relentless. Grant's men were as exhausted as their counterparts, but they were well-fed and fueled by the scent of victory. They marched through the night, guided by the light of the Confederates' abandoned, burning wagons. For the Confederate soldiers, the march became a waking nightmare. Sleep was a luxury they couldn't afford. They would march for a few miles, collapse from exhaustion, only to be prodded awake moments later by their officers as the Union vanguard drew near. Food was almost non-existent. They chewed on raw corn kernels, buds from trees, anything to quell the gnawing hunger in their stomachs. Many simply couldn't go on. They fell out of the ranks by the hundreds, some collapsing from starvation, others simply giving up and waiting for the Union soldiers to capture them. The once proud Army of Northern Virginia was disintegrating on the march. By April 8th, Lee had reached the vicinity of Appomattox Court House. Another supply train was waiting for him just a few miles ahead, at Appomattox Station. It was his last hope. If he could reach those supplies, he might be able to re-energize his men for one final push to escape. But Grant and Sheridan were one step ahead. That evening, while Lee's starving soldiers rested, Sheridan's cavalry, under the command of the young firebrand George Armstrong Custer, staged a daring raid. They swept down on Appomattox Station, capturing the crucial supply trains and scattering the Confederate guards. They then positioned themselves on the high ground west of Appomattox Court House, directly in Lee's path. The last door had been slammed shut. When news of the capture of the trains reached Lee's headquarters, the grim reality set in. There was nowhere left to run. The next morning, on April 9th, Palm Sunday, Lee made one final, desperate attempt to break out. He ordered his infantry, now numbering fewer than 10,000 effective soldiers, to attack Sheridan's cavalry line and clear the way. The Confederate attack began at dawn. Initially, they had some success, pushing the Union cavalrymen back from the ridge. But just as a flicker of hope appeared, the Confederate soldiers crested the hill and froze. Arrayed before them, in neat lines of battle, was not just cavalry, but the entire Union, the 5th Corps Day and the 24th Corps Stents of thousands of fresh infantry. The cavalry had just been holding the line, waiting for the infantry to arrive. The trap was sprung. The Army of Northern Virginia was completely surrounded. One of Lee's commanders, General John B. Gordon, sent a message back to Lee. "Tell General Lee I have fought my corps to a frazzle, and I fear I can do nothing unless I am heavily supported by Longstreet's corps. but Longstreet's men were miles away, holding off the Union pursuit from the rear. There was no one left to send. The fight was over. Lee, looking at the report, knew what he had to do. "Then there is nothing left for me to do," he said quietly, "but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." The pursuit was over. The surrender was at hand. Thank you for watching, and be sure to follow for the final chapter of this incredible story. April 5th, 1865. General Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia are in full retreat. The fall of Richmond and Petersburg has forced them onto the road, a ragged, starving column stretching for miles. But Lee has a plan, a glimmer of hope in this desperate hour. His objective is Amelia Court House, a small Virginia town 36 miles west of Petersburg. Why? Dead? Because that's where the supplies are supposed to be. Food for his starving men and forage for his equally famished horses and mules. Lee had sent explicit orders ahead. So rations and ammunition were to be rushed from Richmond to Amelia Court House via the Richmond and Danville Railroad. This single rail line was now the Army's lifeline. If the supplies were there, they could refuel, rearm, and continue their march south to link up with General Johnston's forces in North Carolina. It was a race against time, and a race against the pursuing Union Army under General Grant. The march was grueling. The roads were clogged with mud, turning the retreat into a slow, agonizing slog. Men who hadn't eaten a full meal in days dropped from exhaustion. The artillery and supply wagons, heavy and cumbersome, bogged down constantly, slowing the entire column. Yet, they pushed on, driven by the promise of what awaited them at Amelia Court House. The thought of full haversacks and ammunition pouches was a powerful motivator. It was the difference between survival and surrender. Lee himself rode among his troops, his presence a source of strength. Despite his own exhaustion, he projected an air of calm confidence. He knew everything hinged on this rendezvous. If the supplies were there, the army could be saved. They could turn and fight, or at least continue their retreat with renewed strength. The entire strategy depended on the timely arrival of those trains from Richmond. On April 4th, as the vanguard of Lee's army stumbled into Amelia Court House, a wave of anticipation swept through the ranks. They had made it. They had won the race. Men cheered, their spirits lifting for the first time in days. Lee rode into the town, expecting to see rail cars overflowing with bacon, hardtack, and cartridges. He expected to find his commissary officers organizing the distribution, but what he found was nothing. A horrifying, soul-crushing nothing. The railroad sidings were empty. There were no supply trains. Not a single crate of food, not a single box of ammunition. There were plenty of other trains, loaded with administrative records, Treasury Department assets, and even the city government of Richmond, but no rations. A terrible, catastrophic blunder had occurred. The orders had been gobbled. In the chaos of Richmond's evacuation, Lee's urgent dispatch for food had been misinterpreted, or perhaps it was simply lost in the bureaucratic shuffle, instead of sending the critically needed rations for the army. The railroad authorities had sent everything asterisk, but asterisk the rations. They had prioritized moving the Confederate government's archives over feeding the soldiers who were its last line of defense. The disappointment was a physical blow. The cheer that had greeted their arrival died in the men's throats, replaced by a stunned, despairing silence. The hope that had fueled their brutal march evaporated in an instant. This wasn't just a setback. It was a disaster of the highest order. Lee's face, already etched with the strain of the campaign, became a mask of profound grief. He had led his men here on a promise, and that promise was broken. Now, a terrible choice had to be made. The army couldn't move without food. Lee was forced to halt the entire army and send out foraging parties into the surrounding countryside. This was a critical, fatal delay. The countryside around Amelia had already been picked clean by both armies. The foraging parties came back mostly empty-handed, with only a pittance of corn and a few scrawny animals to show for their efforts. This halt cost them everything. It gave the relentless Union cavalry, led by General Philip Sheridan, time to catch up. It gave Grant's infantry the precious hours they needed to close the distance and swing around Lee's flank. Cutting off his route south, the one-day delay at Amelia Court House allowed the Federal forces to seal the trap. While Lee's men scrounged for scraps, the Union Army was positioning itself for the final checkmate. Before the blunder at Amelia, Lee had a genuine chance. His men were veterans, tough, and resilient. With food and a clear path, they could have made it to North Carolina. The war might have dragged on for weeks, or even months longer, but the missing supplies were the turning point within the final campaign. It was the moment the strategic race was lost. The failure to provision the army at Amelia Court House is one of the great what-ifs of the final days of the Civil War. It was a logistical failure that had strategic consequences of the highest magnitude. It broke the spirit of many of the Confederate soldiers who now saw the writing on the wall, starving, exhausted, and now seeing their escape route being cut off. The will to fight began to ebb away. From Amelia Court House onward, the retreat became less of a strategic withdrawal and more of a desperate flight. The next few days would see a series of running battles at places like Sailor's Creek, where a huge portion of Lee's remaining army would be cut off and captured. Each step took them closer, not to safety in North Carolina, but to the inevitable confrontation at a small village called Appomattox Court House. The empty train tracks at Amelia were a symbol of the Confederacy's collapse. An empire that could no longer feed its soldiers could no longer wage a war. For the men of the Army of Northern Virginia, the hunger they felt was now matched by a growing sense of hopelessness. The race for supplies had been lost, and with it, the last real chance for the Confederacy to survive. The road from Amelia led directly to surrender. Thanks so much for watching. If you're finding this series on the final days of the Civil War interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapter in this incredible story. We'll see you in the next video. As the spring of 1865 dawned, the end of the American Civil War was drawing near, but the final act was yet to be written. The air in Virginia was thick, not just with the promise of new blooms, but with the tension of two great armies poised for their last, desperate dance. Ulysses S. Grant, the relentless commander of the Union forces, had Robert E. Lee's famed Army of Northern Virginia cornered. After nearly a year of brutal siege warfare at Petersburg and Richmond, the Confederate lines were stretched thin, worn down by attrition and starvation. Grant's strategy was simple, yet crushingly effective: to encircle, to constrict, and to annihilate. The final campaign began with a thunderous Union assault on the Petersburg defenses. On April 1st, at the Battle of Five Forks, Union General Philip Sheridan shattered the Confederate right flank. This victory was the key that unlocked the entire Confederate defensive system. The loss was so critical that Lee knew he could no longer hold either Petersburg or the Confederate capital, Richmond. The very next day, under the cover of darkness, Lee's grizzled veterans began a desperate evacuation, abandoning the trenches they had defended for so long. Their goal was to march west, link up with General Johnston's forces in North Carolina, and continue the fight. But Grant was a step ahead. As Lee's army began its retreat, it was no longer a proud, powerful force. It was a ghost of its former self, a column of hungry, exhausted men, many without shoes, all clinging to a fading hope. Their march was a race against time, a race against starvation, and a race against the ever-present, blue-coated soldiers of the Union Army. Grant's orders to his commanders were clear and concise: pursue and destroy. He unleashed his cavalry and infantry in a relentless chase, aiming to cut off every possible escape route for Lee's beleaguered army. The Union pursuit was a masterpiece of coordination and speed. While one corps pressed Lee's rear guard, other Union columns marched on parallel roads, striving to get ahead of the Confederates. The strategy was to block their path westward and south. General Sheridan's cavalry, in particular, proved to be a constant thorn in Lee's side. They were everywhere raiding supply wagons, tearing up railroad tracks, and skirmishing with the Confederate vanguard. Every delay, every small fight, costly precious time and energy his men could not afford to lose. The Union troops, well-fed and sensing victory, marched with a determination that was palpable. They knew the end was in sight. One of the most critical moments came at Sailor's Creek on April 6th. Here, the Union forces managed to intercept and cut off nearly a quarter of Lee's army. The battle was a chaotic and brutal affair, fought in thick woods and swampy ground. By the end of the day, a huge portion of the Confederate rear guard, including several generals, was captured. The defeat at Sailor's Creek was a devastating blow. When Lee witnessed the shattered remnants of his army streaming back from the fight, he was reported to have said, "My God, has the army been dissolved?" It was a clear sign that the once invincible Army of Northern Virginia was disintegrating. Following the disaster at Sailor's Creek, Lee's options were dwindling rapidly. His intended route to the south was now blocked. The supplies he desperately hoped to receive at Amelia Court House had never arrived, a logistical failure that sealed his army's fate. Now, the only path left was west, towards Lynchburg, where more supplies supposedly awaited, but even this was a faint hope. The men were starving, forced to eat raw corn and whatever little they could forage from the countryside. Their numbers dwindled daily, not just from battle, but from exhaustion and desertion. Many soldiers, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, simply laid down their arms and went home. Grant, meanwhile, continued to tighten the noose. He drove his men harder and harder, determined not to let Lee slip away. The Union Army was now a massive, sprawling force that covered the landscape. From the north, the east, and the south, blue columns were converging on Lee's struggling army. It was like watching a great net being drawn closed. Every road, every bridge, every railway junction became a strategic point to be seized. Sheridan's cavalry, in a final, brilliant maneuver, raced ahead of Lee's army and captured the vital supply trains waiting at Appomattox Station. This was the final check when Lee learned that his last hope for supplies had been captured, and that Union infantry was now blocking his path of retreat at Appomattox Court House. He knew the game was over. His army was surrounded on three sides. They were starving, exhausted, and outnumbered. To continue fighting would be a needless slaughter of his remaining loyal men. Looking at the Union lines forming in front of him on the morning of April 9th, Lee turned to his staff and said, "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." The encirclement was complete. The final surrender at Appomattox Court House was not just the end of a battle, it was the symbolic end of the Confederacy. Grant's relentless campaign of encirclement, which began in the trenches of Petersburg, had culminated in the capture of an entire army. His strategy of using his superior numbers and resources to pin down, wear out, and surround his opponent had proven devastatingly effective. It was a brutal, grinding form of warfare, but it brought an end to the nation's bloodiest conflict. The image of Grant's troops spreading across the Virginia countryside, like a relentless blue tide, perfectly illustrates the final, closing chapter of the Civil War, a chapter defined by pursuit, desperation, and the inevitable triumph of a strategy of total encirclement. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe for more deep dives into history. The air crackled with a tension that was both ancient and immediate, the kind that precedes a storm or a surrender. It was the evening of April 7th, 1865. The relentless pursuit was taking its toll. General Ulysses S. Grant, ever the pragmatist, ever the soldier who wished for peace even as he waged war, put pen to paper. This wasn't a demand from a victor to the vanquished. It was a message from one soldier to another, a recognition of shared hardship and a plea to end the suffering. Grant's first letter was direct, yet steeped in a profound respect for his adversary. He wrote to General Robert E. Lee, pointing out the stark reality of the situation. Lee's army of Northern Virginia was cornered, its supplies dwindling, its men exhausted beyond measure. Escape was no longer a viable option. Grant wasn't gloating. He was stating a fact. He felt, he wrote, that it was his duty to shift from himself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood. He was asking Lee to surrender, not just his army, but the very cause for which they fought, to prevent more death. He proposed that Lee surrendered that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. Imagine receiving such a letter. For 4 long, brutal years, Robert E. Lee had been the embodiment of the Confederate spirit. His tactical genius was legendary, his leadership almost mythical. Now, his greatest rival was offering him a way out, but it was a path of capitulation. Lee received the message that night, his army on the move, desperate to find a path to safety, to find food. The letter must have felt like a physical blow. Yet, his duty was to his men, to his cause. He couldn't simply give up. Not yet. So, Lee replied. His response was a masterclass in diplomacy under duress. He began by acknowledging Grant's letter, but he didn't accept the premise. He stated that he did not agree with Grant's assessment of the hopelessness of his army's situation. He wasn't ready to concede defeat. To do so would be to admit that every sacrifice, every life lost, had been in vain. But, interestingly, he didn't shut the door completely. He turned the tables slightly. He asked Grant what terms he would offer if he were to surrender. It was a subtle shift, a way of gathering information without committing to anything. It was a probing question, buying time, keeping the conversation alive while still searching for a miracle, for an escape route that seemed to vanish with every passing hour. This exchange set the stage for one of the most poignant dialogues in American history, conducted not face-to-face, but through the measured, formal language of military correspondence. The letters crisscrossed the Virginia countryside, carried by couriers who navigated the treacherous space between two armies still technically at war. Grant received Lee's reply on the morning of April 8th. He was on the march, ever present with his troops. Lee's question about terms was the opening Grant had hoped for. He responded immediately, his penmanship as clear and steady as his resolve. His terms were simple and astonishingly generous. It's here we see the true character of Grant. He wasn't seeking to humiliate his enemy. He was seeking to heal a nation. He wrote that there was really only one condition: that the men and officers surrendered should be disqualified from taking up arms again against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. This was it. No mass imprisonments, no treason trials, no public shaming. Lay down your arms, promise not to fight again, and you can go home. He even went a step further, proposing they meet to arrange the definite terms of surrender. He was offering Lee a dignified exit. He wanted to talk general, to finalize the peace. These were not the terms of a conqueror bent on vengeance. They were the terms of a statesman looking towards the future. A future where North and South would once again have to live as one nation. Grant understood that a hush peace would only plant the seeds for future conflict. A magnanimous peace, however, could begin the long, painful process of reconciliation. Meanwhile, Lee's situation was growing more desperate by the minute. His starving soldiers, stumbling through the mud, were finding their path blocked at every turn. The rations they had hoped to receive at Appomattox Station had been captured by Union cavalry. The last glimmer of hope was being extinguished. The correspondence continued, but the reality on the ground was outpacing the ink on the page. Lee received Grant's second letter and replied again. He was still not ready to surrender the army itself, but he proposed a meeting. He suggested they meet between the picket lines on the old stage road to Richmond the next morning. April 9 barrier es de crucial distinction. Lee's stated purpose for this meeting was not to surrender his army, but to discuss the restoration of peace. He was elevating the conversation, trying to position himself not just as a general surrendering a single army, but as a leader negotiating a broader peace for the entire Confederacy. This was a missed chance, a slight misreading of the situation. Grant, upon receiving this message, was disappointed. He was a military commander. His authority extended to accepting the surrender of an opposing army, not to negotiating a national political peace. That was the job of President Lincoln and the government. Grant could not and would not overstep his authority. He wrote back to Lee, clarifying this point. He stated he had no authority to treat on the subject of peace. The meeting Lee proposed for political discussion, Grant said, could lead to no good. He reiterated his point. The only thing he could do was accept the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia on the terms he had already outlined. The gravity of this moment is immense. For a brief period, it seemed as if the letters, meant to bring them together, might actually be driving them apart due to a misunderstanding of roles and authority. Lee was thinking like the head of a nation. Grant was acting strictly as the commander of the United States armies. As the sun rose on April 9th, Palm Sunday, the final, desperate act of the Army of Northern Virginia played out. Lee's men attempted one last breakout, a valiant but futile charge against the Union lines. They soon discovered they were not just facing cavalry. They were facing masses of Union infantry. The army was completely surrounded. The game was up. The last move had been played. It was then that General Lee, dressed in his finest uniform, finally understood. There were no more options. There was no escape. The only thing left to do was to prevent the final, pointless slaughter of his men. He turned to one of his aides and said, "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." He penned one last, short message to Grant. He requested an interview in accordance with Grant's letter, for the purpose of surrendering his army. The careful dance of words was over. The diplomatic maneuvering was finished. The raw, undeniable truth of their situation had finally been written down. The messages had done their work, and now all that remained was the meeting, the handshake, and the quiet, somber signing of the papers that would begin the end of the American Civil War. The missed chances were forgotten, replaced by a single, momentous opportunity for peace. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this chapter of history as moving as I did, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. We'll see you in the next one. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our deep dive into the American Civil War. Today, we've arrived at a pivotal moment in our nation's history. Chapter 13, the final skirmishes. These aren't the grand, sweeping battles we've often discussed. Instead, these are the last, desperate gasps of a conflict that had torn the country apart for 4 long years. We are refocusing on the small but incredibly significant fights that unfolded around a little Virginia town called Appomattox Court House, moments that truly signaled the end was near. By April 1865, General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was in a desperate situation. They were starving, exhausted, and relentlessly pursued by General Ulysses S. Grant's Union forces. After abandoning the Confederate capital of Richmond, Lee's plan was to march west, resupply his army, and hopefully link up with other Confederate forces in North Carolina. But Grant's army was like a shadow, constantly moving to cut off every possible escape route. Lee's objective was a place called Appomattox Station, where he believed crucial supply trains were waiting for his beleaguered men. Food, ammunition, everything they needed to continue the fight was supposed to be there. For the soldiers in the ranks, the thought of those supplies was the only thing keeping them on their feet. However, the Union Army understood Lee's intentions perfectly. Union cavalry, commanded by the brilliant and aggressive General Philip Sheridan, was racing to get ahead of Lee's army. Their mission was simple: capture those supply trains at Appomattox Station before the Confederates could reach them. This set the stage for a dramatic race against time. On the evening of April 8, 1865, the advance elements of Lee's army, a small Confederate artillery force under General Reuben Lindsay Walker, were the first to approach Appomattox Station. They were expecting to find friendly faces and full boxcars. Instead, they found Union cavalry, led by the tenacious General George Armstrong Custer. What happened next was a swift and decisive engagement. Custer's cavalry division charged into the unprepared Confederate artillerymen. The fight was brief, chaotic, and utterly one-sided. The Union troopers overwhelmed the small Confederate force, capturing the precious supply trains that Lee was counting on. This wasn't a major battle in terms of numbers, but its strategic impact was devastating. Imagine the scene. Lee's starving army is marching towards their last hope for survival, only to hear the sounds of battle and realize that their salvation has just been snatched away by the enemy. The news of the capture of the trains spread like wildfire through the Confederate ranks, and the blow to morale was immense. For many soldiers, this was the moment they knew it was truly over. There was no more food, no more hope of escape. But the fighting wasn't quite finished. As night fell on April 8th, Lee held a final council of war with his key commanders, including General Longstreet and General Gordon. Despite the dire situation, they decided to make one last attempt to break through the Union lines. Their plan was to attack the Union cavalry in front of them at dawn on April 9th. They believed they were only facing a thin screen of cavalry that their infantry could punch through, clearing a path to the west and to safety. The task fell to General John B. Gordon's 2nd Corps, supported by Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry. These were some of the most battle-hardened soldiers in the entire Confederate Army, but they were a shadow of their former strength. So, on the morning of April 9th, as the sun rose over the rolling hills of Virginia, the last major charge of the Army of Northern Virginia began. Gordon's men surged forward, attacking Sheridan's cavalrymen, who were dismounted and holding a line across the Lynchburg Stage Road. Initially, the attack was successful. The weary but determined Confederates pushed the Union troopers back, clearing the ridge. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed like the escape route might be open. The Confederates cheered, thinking they had broken through. But as they crested the ridge, their cheers died in their throats. What they saw before them was not an open road, but a sea of blue. Waiting behind the cavalry was not an empty field, but two entire corps of Union infantry, the 5th Corps and the 24th Corps, arrayed in a massive line of battle, their bayonets glistening in the morning sun. The Union plan had worked perfectly. While the cavalry had held the Confederates in place, The infantry had marched through the night to get into position. The Confederate attack stalled immediately. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely trapped. General Gordon, seeing the overwhelming force in front of him, knew that any further attack would be a needless slaughter. He sent a message back to General Lee. "Tell General Lee, I have fought my corps to a frazzle, and I fear I can do nothing unless I am heavily supported by Longstreet's corps." But Longstreet's men were engaged with other Union forces to the rear. There was no support coming. The trap had closed. This was the final check. Hemmed in on all sides, with no supplies and no hope of escape, Lee faced a terrible choice: surrender or sacrifice his remaining men. In a pointless final stand, he looked at the Union lines, then at his own exhausted soldiers, and said, "Then there is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." A Confederate officer, seeing the futility of it all, waved a white towel from a pole. The firing slowly sputtered to a stop along the lines. The fighting, the marching, the suffering, it was finally coming to an end. These last skirmishes at Appomattox Station and on the morning of April 9th were not grand battles, but they were the decisive final acts that forced the surrender. They were the punctuation mark at the end of a long, bloody sentence in American history. Later that day, General Lee would meet General Grant in the parlor of the McLean House in the village of Appomattox Court House to formally surrender the Army of Northern Virginia. The terms Grant offered were generous, allowing the Confederate soldiers to return home after pledging not to take up arms again. It was a moment of quiet dignity that helped set the stage for the difficult process of national reconciliation. The final skirmishes, though small, were the catalysts for this historic moment. They were the final, frantic heartbeats of the Confederacy before silence fell over the battlefields of Virginia. They represent the precise moment when the will to fight was finally broken by the hard reality of defeat, paving the way for the end of the war and the beginning of a new, reunited America. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of Appomattox is a powerful reminder of how even the smallest actions can have monumental consequences. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button, subscribe for more chapters, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you next time as we continue our journey through history. The morning of April 9th, 1865, dawned cold and bleak over the Virginia countryside. For the men of the Army of Northern Virginia, it was a morning like any other in a long, brutal war. Yet it felt different. A palpable tension hung in the air, thick as the morning mist. General Robert E. Lee, the revered commander of the Confederacy, faced a reality as stark and unforgiving as the barren fields around him. His army, once the most formidable fighting force on the continent, was now a shadow of its former self. They had marched and fought for 4 long years, sustained by an unyielding belief in their cause and their commander Lee. He had shared their hardships, their triumphs, and their sorrows. He loved these men as a father loves his sons, and the thought of sacrificing even one more life in a hopeless struggle was unbearable to him. Earlier that morning, Lee had made a final, desperate attempt to break through the Union lines that encircled them at Appomattox Court House. He had hoped to reach the railroad at Lynchburg, where supplies were said to be waiting. It was a long shot, a gambler's last throw of the dice. He sent forth his cavalry, led by the fiery General John B. Gordon, with the remnants of his infantry following close behind. The initial assault was surprisingly successful. The weary Confederates, driven by desperation, surged forward and pushed back the Union cavalry blocking their path. For a brief moment, a glimmer of hope flickered. Perhaps a miracle was possible. Perhaps they could escape the closing jaws of the trap. But the hope was fleeting. As Gordon's men crested a small rise, they stopped dead in their tracks. The sight before them was enough to quell any last vestige of fighting spirit. Spread out across the valley, blocking their path of escape, was not just cavalry, but an entire corps of Union infantry. Their blue uniforms a seemingly endless sea, bayonets glistening in the morning sun. The trap had snapped shut. There was no way forward, and no way back. A courier, riding his horse to exhaustion, galloped back to Lee with the grim news. General Gordon's message was simple and devastating. "Tell General Lee, I have fought my corps to a frazzle, and I fear I can do nothing unless I am heavily supported by Longstreet's corps." Lee listened intently, his face a mask of stoicism, but his eyes betrayed the deep anguish within. He knew that General Longstreet's men were tied up, holding back the Union advance from the rear. There was no support to give. He turned to one of his aides, his voice heavy with the weight of his decision. "Then there is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant," he said, "and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." The words hung in the air. A final, somber admission of defeat. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. The cause, for which so much blood had been shed, was lost. The decision made, a strange calm settled over Lee. The burden of command, the relentless pressure of the past 4 years, seemed to lift from his shoulders. He called for his finest uniform, a pristine gray coat with a red sash, and a gleaming sword at his side. This was not an act of vanity, but one of respect. He was not surrendering as a broken man, but as the commander of a valiant army, representing the honor of his soldiers. He mounted his beloved horse, Traveler, a magnificent gray stallion that had carried him through so many battles, accompanied by a single aide, Colonel Charles Marshall, and a lone soldier carrying a white flag of truce, a simple white dish towel. As no proper flag could be found, Lee rode out from his lines. The small party moved slowly toward the enemy, the white flag fluttering gently in the breeze. It was a stark, poignant symbol, a silent announcement that the fighting was to cease. As Lee and his small escort rode across the no man's land between the two armies, an eerie silence fell over the battlefield. The crack of rifles and the boom of cannons, the constant soundtrack of their lives for years, faded away. Soldiers on both sides, who moments before had been trying to kill each other, poked their heads up from behind their breastworks and trenches. They watched in stunned disbelief as the iconic figure of Robert E. Lee rode toward the Union lines. News of the truce spread like wildfire. A spontaneous cheer erupted from the Union ranks, a roar of relief and jubilation that rolled across the valley. They knew what this meant. The war was over. They were going home. But on the Confederate side, there were no cheers. There was only a profound, heartbreaking silence. Men openly wept, leaning on their rifles for support. They had followed this man, their Marseillais Robert, with unwavering loyalty. To see him now, riding to surrender, was to witness the death of their nation, the end of their world. They crowded the roadside, reaching out to touch his horse, to catch one last glimpse of their beloved general. Lee, his own eyes misty, could only nod in acknowledgement, his heart breaking for them. Lee. Lee's message requesting a meeting to discuss terms of surrender was quickly relayed to General Ulysses S. Grant. Grant, who had been relentlessly pursuing Lee for weeks, received the message on the front lines. He had been suffering from a severe headache, but upon reading Lee's note, he said the pain instantly vanished. Grant was not a man for pomp or ceremony. He was a pragmatist soldier, dressed in a simple, mud-splattered private's uniform, his only insignia of rank being the 3 stars on his shoulder straps. He agreed to meet Lee and suggested the small village of Appomattox Court House as a suitable location. A search began for an appropriate house. The first one approached was deemed to run down, but then a local resident, Wilmer McLean, offered his comfortable brick home. By a strange twist of fate, McLean had moved to Appomattox to escape the war after his previous home near Manassas had been shelled during the very first major battle of the conflict at Bull Run. The war, which had started in his backyard, was now, quite literally, ending in his front parlor. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, General Lee arrived at the McLean House. He dismounted Traveler and waited patiently on the porch. A short time later, Grant and his staff arrived. The two great adversaries who had fought each other with such tenacity across the state of Virginia were about to meet face to face, for the first time since they had served together briefly in the Mexican-American War years before. Grant walked up the steps, and the two generals shook hands. They entered the parlor, a simple room furnished with 2 small tables and a few chairs. Lee, tall, stately, and impeccably dressed, sat at one table. Grant, shorter, slouched, and dressed in his rough field uniform, took a seat at the other. For a few moments, they spoke of old army days. A brief, slightly awkward attempt to bridge the vast chasm that the war had created between them. Then, Lee, ever the gentleman, gently brought the conversation around to the purpose of their meeting. "I suppose, General Grant," he began, "that the object of our present meeting is fully understood. I asked to see you to ascertain upon what terms you would receive the surrender of my army." Grant's terms were simple and generous, reflecting his desire for reconciliation, not retribution. He proposed that the Confederate soldiers lay down their arms, sine parole, agreeing not to fight against the United States again, and then they would be free to return to their homes. He would not take them as prisoners of war. He explained that they would need the animals for the spring planting to work their farms and feed their families. With the terms agreed upon, the official documents of surrender were drafted and signed. As he stood on the porch, waiting for Traveler to be brought around, he looked out over the fields, where his army lay silent. He struck his fist into his palm 3 times in a gesture of deep, controlled emotion. When he mounted his horse, the Union officers standing on the porch, including Grant himself, respectfully removed their hats. It was a final salute to a worthy and honorable foe. Lee rode back through the lines of his own men, who rushed to greet him, their faces a mixture of grief and love. "Men," he told them, his voice thick with emotion, "we have fought through the war together. I have done the best I could for you. My heart is too full to say more." The formal surrender ceremony took place 3 days later, on April 12th. It was a somber, dignified affair. The Confederate troops marched one last time to stack their rifles and furl their tattered battle flags. The Union officer in charge, General Joshua Chamberlain, the hero of Gettysburg, ordered his men to salute their former enemies as they marched past. It was a final, poignant act of respect, a recognition of their shared sacrifice, and a hopeful first step on the long, difficult road to reuniting a nation that had been torn apart. The appearance of the white flag at Appomattox was more than just the end of a battle. It was the end of an era and the beginning of a new, uncertain, but ultimately hopeful chapter in American history. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe for more stories from our nation's past. Welcome back to our journey through the American Civil War. Today, we arrive at a place that, for most of its existence, was just a quiet, unassuming village in central Virginia. Appomattox Court House. It's a name that would echo through history. But in early April of 1865, it was simply a stop on the road, a collection of about 20 houses, a tavern, a small courthouse, and a few shops. Imagine a peaceful, almost sleepy hamlet, nestled in the rolling hills, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the changing seasons, not the drumbeat of war. The war had raged for 4 long, brutal years, touching nearly every corner of the nation. Yet this small village had remained largely untouched, a pocket of tranquility in a sea of conflict. T-Mine Road, the Richmond-Lynchburg stage road, ran right through the center of the village. This was the artery of the community, where farmers brought their goods, where neighbors exchanged pleasantries, and where news from the outside world trickled in. Life here was ordinary. Families worked their land, children played in the dusty streets, and the community gathered at the courthouse, which served not just as a legal center but as the social hub of the county. It was a place defined by its simplicity and its sense of normalcy, a stark contrast to the chaos and upheaval that had consumed the country. Little did its residents know that their quiet home was about to become the stage for one of the most significant moments in American history. The forces of fate, embodied by 2 weary armies, were converging on this very spot. By April 1865, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, led by General Robert E. Lee, was in a desperate retreat. After the fall of Petersburg and the Confederate capital, Richmond, Lee's men were exhausted, starving, and vastly outnumbered. Their goal was to reach Lynchburg, another Virginia city to the west, where crucial supply trains were waiting. If they could get there, they might be able to resupply and continue the fight, perhaps by linking up with other Confederate forces in North Carolina. But the Union Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, was in relentless pursuit. Union cavalry, light and fast, raced ahead of their infantry, determined to cut off Lee's path of retreat. The chase was a brutal affair. It was a running battle, fought over miles of muddy roads and dense woods. For Lee's men, It was a nightmare of constant marching with little to no food. Their uniforms were tattered, many were shoeless, and their once proud ranks were thinning with each passing day due to desertion and capture. Yet, they pushed on, driven by loyalty to their general and the last glimmers of hope. For the Union soldiers, it was a test of endurance. They were better fed and equipped, but they were just as exhausted from the relentless pace set by Grant. He was determined not to let Lee slip away. The end of the war was in sight, and Grant knew that cornering Lee's army would mean the collapse of the Confederacy. The final act of this dramatic pursuit began to unfold on the evening of April 8th. Union cavalry, under the command of General Philip Sheridan, had made a heroic forced march, covering nearly 30 miles in a single day to get ahead of Lee's army. They successfully blocked the stage road just west of Appomattox Court House, capturing the supply trains that were Lee's last hope. When Lee's vanguard, his hungry and exhausted soldiers, arrived the next morning, Appomattox, they expected to find only a thin screen of cavalry that they could brush aside. They launched an attack, and for a moment, it seemed like they might break through. But then, as the morning mist cleared, the Confederates saw a horrifying sight. Behind the Union cavalry, arrayed on the high ground, were massive formations of Union infantry too. Entire army corps that had marched through the night to be there. The game was up. Lee's army was trapped. They were surrounded on 3 sides, with their escape route to the west firmly blocked. There was no way forward, and no hope of rescue. The Army of Northern Virginia, the force that had won so many improbable victories and had been the backbone of the Confederacy, was finally at the end of its rope. Faced with the stark reality of the situation, General Lee knew he had only one choice left if he wanted to prevent the further, needless slaughter of his men. He turned to one of his aides and said, with heavy resignation, "There is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." The decision was made. Lee would surrender. A ceasefire was called, and messengers were sent out under flags of truce. Lee sent a note to Grant requesting a meeting to discuss the terms of surrender. The location chosen for this momentous meeting was the village of Appomattox Court House itself. It was chosen simply for convenience. It was the ground where the two armies had finally come to a halt. A staff officer was sent to find a suitable private home for the generals to meet. He happened upon a man named Wilmer McLean. McLean was a grocer who had moved his family to Appomattox Court House in 1863 to escape the war. Ironically, his former home near Manassas had been the site of the First Battle of Bull Run, one of the first major battles of the war. As McLean himself would later say, the war started in his front yard and ended in his front parlor. And so, the stage was set in the parlor of the McLean House, a comfortable, 2-story brick home right in the village. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, General Lee arrived. He was the picture of dignity and command, dressed immaculately in a brand-new gray uniform with a sash and a jeweled sword at his side. He had prepared himself to become a prisoner of war. He waited patiently, his thoughts known only to him, as the fate of his army and his nation hung in the balance. About 30 minutes later, General Grant arrived. His appearance was a study in contrasts. He was splattered with mud from his hard ride, wearing a private's flannel shirt with only his shoulder straps to denote his rank. He had no sword. Grant was not there for ceremony. He was there to end a war. The two men greeted each other respectfully. They had known each other slightly from the old army before the war, and they spent a few minutes making small talk, reminiscing about their time in the Mexican-American War. There was an awkwardness in the air, a sense of the immense weight of the moment. Grant, feeling the delicacy of the situation, later wrote that he felt sad and depressed at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly. Finally, it was Lee who brought the conversation back to the purpose of their meeting. He asked what terms Grant would offer. Grant's response would prove to be one of the most important and healing gestures in American history. Grant's terms were simple and astonishingly generous. He proposed that the Confederate soldiers lay down their arms and pledge not to take them up again against the United States. They would be paroled and allowed to return to their homes, not to be disturbed by U.S. authorities. Crucially, Grant did not ask for unconditional surrender in the traditional sense. He wasn't planning to march the defeated army off to prison camps. He was planning to send them home. Lee was visibly relieved. He had expected harsher terms. He then brought up a practical matter. His men particularly the cavalry and artillerymen, owned their own horses and mules. He asked if they would be allowed to keep them. These weren't army-issue animals. They were personal property, essential for the soldiers to get home and, more importantly, to plant crops for the coming season. Grant had not initially included this in his written terms, but without hesitation, he agreed. He understood that these men were no longer just soldiers. They were farmers and citizens who needed to rebuild their lives. He told Lee he would not amend the written terms, but would give the order to allow the men to keep their animals. "This will have the best possible effect upon the men," Lee said with gratitude. "It will be very gratifying and will do much toward conciliating our people." With the terms agreed upon, the formal documents were drafted and signed. The meeting, which lasted about an hour and a half, was over. The two generals shook hands. Lee bowed, and he walked out of the McLean House. As Lee mounted his famous horse, Traveler, and rode away, a spontaneous cheer began to rise from the Union soldiers who had gathered outside. Grant immediately ordered it stopped. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." This act of respect set the tone for what was to follow. There was no grand celebration, no gloating, no humiliation of the defeated. There was only a quiet, somber sense of relief that the long and bloody conflict was finally drawing to a close. Over the next few days, the formal surrender ceremony took place. On April 12th, the Confederate infantry stacked their rifles and furled their battle flags for the last time. The Union officer in charge of the ceremony, General Joshua Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top at Gettysburg, ordered his men to salute their former enemies. As they marched past, it was a final, poignant gesture of reconciliation. The surrender at Appomattox did not technically end the Civil War. Confederate forces were still in the field, but it was the beginning of the end. The news spread like wildfire, bringing joy and relief to the North, and a mixture of sorrow, resignation, and uncertainty to the South. The events at Appomattox Court House were more than just a military surrender. They were a profound statement about the future of the United States. The generosity of Grant's terms and the mutual respect shown by the soldiers on both sides laid a foundation for national reconciliation. It was a moment that could have been filled with vengeance and retribution, but instead, it was marked by grace and a shared desire for peace. The quiet village of Appomattox Court House, once an anonymous dot on the map, became a symbol of reunion, a place where a divided nation took its first steps toward becoming one again. It stands today as a powerful reminder that even after the bitterest of conflicts, there is always the possibility of peace and a shared future. I hope this story gives you a deeper appreciation for the complex and human moments that brought our nation's greatest trial to a close. If you found this video insightful, please give it a like, and do you forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We'll be exploring the aftermath of the war and the immense challenges of Reconstruction. Welcome back to our journey through the final days of the Civil War. Today, we're stepping into Chapter 16, a moment frozen in time at a simple brick home in rural Virginia, the McLean House. This wasn't a grand Capitol building or a fortified military headquarters. It was the private residence of a grocer named Wilmer McLean, a man who, in a strange twist of fate, had moved to Appomattox Court House to escape the war after the first major battle raged across his previous farm at Manassas. War, it seemed, had followed him. Imagine the scene on April 9, 1865. The village is small, quiet, just a handful of buildings along a country road. There's an air of immense tension, but also of profound exhaustion. The armies of Grant and Lee have fought to a standstill. Lee, recognizing the inevitable, has requested a meeting to discuss surrender. He arrives first, impeccably dressed in his finest gray uniform, complete with a sash and a ceremonial sort of portrait of dignity and defeat. He waits, pacing in the parlor of the McLean House, a room furnished not for heads of state, but for a middle-class family. There are small tables, a horsehair sofa, and simple chairs. It's a very human, very civilian space. Then, General Grant arrives. His appearance is a stark contrast. He's spattered with mud from his ride, wearing a private's flannel shirt with his general's straps sewn on. He has no sword, no pomp. He looks less like a conquering hero and more like a field commander who has just come from the front lines, which he had. The two men had known each other briefly during the Mexican-American War, and they began their conversation by reminiscing about those old days. This small talk, this moment of shared history, was crucial. It wasn't about gloating or humiliation. It was about two soldiers, two Americans, finding common ground. The setting itself played a vital role in this. The humble parlor of the McLean House stripped away the trappings of military might and political power. It wasn't a victor's tent or a vanquished stronghold. It was neutral ground, a domestic space that fostered a sense of calm and civility. Surrounded by the everyday objects of family life, it was easier for these two powerful men to conduct their business with mutual respect. The atmosphere was somber, not triumphant. Grant was keenly aware of the weight of the moment and was determined to avoid any action that would further wound the pride of the Confederate soldiers. He set the tone by offering generous terms. These men would not be taken as prisoners of war. They would be paroled and allowed to return home. Grant even stipulated that any Confederate soldier who owned his own horse or mule could take it with him to help with the spring planting. This was an act of extraordinary foresight and compassion. Grant understood that the goal wasn't just to win the war, but to begin the difficult process of healing a fractured nation. He wasn't just ending a conflict, he was laying the groundwork for reunification. The terms weren't about punishment, they were about reconstruction, both literally for the farms and fields, and metaphorically for the soul of the country. As Lee read the terms, a look of immense relief washed over his face. The generosity of the offer was more than he had expected. He noted that the Union cavalry had captured many of their supply trains, and his men were starving. Immediately, Grant ordered that 25,000 rations be sent to the hungry Confederate army. This act of feeding a former enemy was a powerful symbol of the spirit of reconciliation that Grant wished to foster. The negotiations in that small parlor were not about a victor dictating to the vanquished. They were a quiet, dignified conversation that honored the humanity of everyone involved. The McLean House, therefore, is more than just a historical landmark. It's a symbol of how peace can be made. It teaches us that the environment in which we resolve our differences matters. The modesty of the setting helped shape the modesty and respectfulness of the outcome. In that quiet room, away from the roar of cannons and the shouts of battle, two generals demonstrated that even at the end of the bloodiest conflict in American history, magnanimity and honor could prevail. It was a somber, respectful end to the war, not a celebration. When news of the surrender reached the Union lines, soldiers began to cheer, but Grant ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." This quiet, profound moment in a simple Virginia home was the first crucial step toward stitching the United States back together. The story of the McLean House isn't about grand strategy or tactical genius. It's about the power of decency and respect in the face of division. It's a reminder that the most significant moments in history often happen not in palaces, but in ordinary places, between people choosing a better path forward. Thank you for watching. If you found this chapter of history meaningful, please like this video and subscribe for more. We'll see you next time. When we think of surrender, we often picture total defeat, humiliation, and punishment. But what happened at Appomattox Court House on April 9th, 1865, was something entirely different. It was a moment that would define the very soul of a reunited America. And it all came down to the terms of surrender offered by one man, Ulysses S. Grant. The scene is almost hard to imagine. General Robert D. Lee, the embodiment of the Southern cause, arrives in his finest uniform, prepared to meet his fate. General Grant, on the other hand, shows up in a mud-splattered private's uniform, his mind not on victory, but on the monumental task of healing a deeply wounded nation. The negotiations were surprisingly brief, direct, and filled with a profound sense of mutual respect. Lee asked for the terms, and Grant, without a hint of triumphalism, laid them out. The first and most crucial term was this: the Confederate soldiers, after laying down their arms, would be paroled and allowed to return to their homes. They would not be taken as prisoners of war, paraded through northern cities, or thrown into camps. They were simply to go home and agree not to take up arms against the United States again. This was a stunning act of mercy. 4 men who had been fighting for 4 long, brutal years, who were exhausted, starving, and far from their families. This was the greatest gift they could receive. It was a promise not of continued conflict, but of peace and a return to normalcy. Grant didn't stop there. He added another provision that spoke volumes. Confederate officers would be permitted to keep their sidearms, their pistols, and their personal swords. In the 19th century, an officer's sword was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of his honor, his identity as a gentleman and a soldier. To take it away would have been a profound act of personal humiliation. By allowing them to keep their swords, Grant was signaling that this was not about shaming defeated men. It was about recognizing their dignity, even in surrender. He was treating them not as traitors, but as fellow Americans who had fought bravely for a cause they believed in, a cause that had now been lost. This simple gesture helped preserve the honor of the Southern officers, making the bitterness of defeat just a little easier to swallow. But perhaps the most practical and far-sighted term was one that Grant added after Lee brought it up. Lee mentioned that in the Confederate Army, unlike the Union Army, many of the cavalrymen and artillerists owned their own horses and mules. He worried what would become of these animals. Without a moment's hesitation, Grant expanded his terms. He decreed that any man who claimed to own a horse or a mule could take it home with him. Think about what this meant. These weren't just soldiers. They were farmers. It was April. Spring planting season was upon them. Without a horse or a mule, a farmer couldn't plow his fields. Without plowed fields, there would be no crops. Without crops, their families would starve. The South was already devastated, its economy in ruins, and its landscape scarred by war. Grant understood that rebuilding the nation meant rebuilding the lives of its people, and that started with the ability to put food on the table. He famously said he wanted to see these men get to planting so they could raise a crop and feed their families. This wasn't the act of a conqueror. It was the act of a statesman. He was looking beyond the battlefield to the future of a united country. He was investing in the reconstruction of the South, one farmer, one horse at a time. These terms of surrender were revolutionary. In an age where defeated armies were often imprisoned, executed, or sold into servitude, Grant chose a different path. He chose magnanimity. He chose reconciliation over retribution. He understood that to truly win the peace, you couldn't just defeat your enemy. You had to help them become your countrymen again. His focus was entirely on healing the deep divisions that had torn the nation apart. There would be no treason trials for Lee and his men, no victory parades designed to rub salt in the wound. In fact, when Union soldiers began to cheer at the news of the surrender, Grant immediately ordered them to stop. "The rebels are our countrymen again," he told his officers. "We do not want to exult over their downfall." This spirit of generosity set the tone for the end of the war. It sent a powerful message to the remaining Confederate forces still fighting elsewhere. Surrender would not mean annihilation. It would mean peace, a return all may, and a chance to rebuild. Lee himself was deeply moved by the terms, telling Grant they would have a very happy effect upon his army. He knew that this wasn't a victor's justice, but a pathway back into the Union. The meeting at Appomattox was more than just a military surrender. It was the first step in a long and difficult journey of national healing. Grant's terms were not a sign of weakness, but of immense strength and wisdom. He recognized that the only way for the United States to have a future was to put the bitterness of the war behind them, start the hard work of becoming one nation again. It was an act of grace that planted the seeds of reunion, demonstrating that true victory isn't about crushing your opponent, but about building a lasting peace together. This chapter in our history reminds us that even in the aftermath of the most terrible conflicts, compassion and foresight can pave the way for a better future. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this story as powerful as I do, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more chapters from our shared past. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the American Civil War. In our last chapter, we witnessed the solemn meeting between General Robert E. Lee and Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant inside the McLean House at Appomattox Court House. The terms of surrender, generous and honorable, had been agreed upon. Now, we arrive at the poignant conclusion of that historic encounter. The ink on the documents was barely dry. The weight of 4 long, bloody years hung in the air, a silent, heavy presence in the small parlor. General Lee, his face a mask of dignified composure, rose from his chair. He shook hands with General Grant one last time, a simple gesture that carried the gravity of a nation's fate. He then turned and walked out of the room, followed by his trusted aide, Colonel Charles Marshall. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath. The April sun cast long shadows across the dusty village street. Lee's magnificent gray horse, Traveler, was waiting. As Lee mounted, the Union officers standing on the porch of the McLean House, including General Grant himself, instinctively removed their hats. It was a silent, profound gesture of respect for a defeated but noble adversary. Lee, ever the gentleman, returned the salute by raising his own hat. He then turned Traveler's head and began the slow ride back toward his own lines, back to the men who had followed him through victory and now, finally, to this day of surrender. General Grant remained on the porch for a moment, watching Lee disappear down the lane. There was no gloating, no triumphant roar. Grant's demeanor was quiet, almost somber. He later wrote that he felt sad and depressed at the fall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly. For him, this was not a moment of victory parades, but a moment to begin the hard work of healing a fractured nation. After Lee was out of sight, Grant spoke briefly with his staff, then mounted his own horse, Cincinnati, and rode off to his headquarters to send the official news to Washington. As word of the surrender began to ripple through the ranks, a strange and varied reaction took hold. On the Union side, soldiers who had been preparing for another assault couldn't believe it was over. The tension of battle readiness slowly gave way to a surge of relief and joy. Spontaneous cheers erupted along the Federal lines. Cannons, which just hours before were meant for destruction, were now being fired in celebration. But this celebration was short. General Grant, hearing the celebratory cannon fire, immediately sent an order to stop it. He understood that the men on the other side of the field were no longer the enemy. They were their countrymen once more. He would not have them humiliated. His order read, "The war is over. The rebels are our countrymen again, and the best way to rejoice after the victory will be to abstain from all demonstrations in the field." This act of compassion set the tone for the days to come, emphasizing reconciliation over retribution. For the Confederate soldiers in the Army of Northern Virginia, the news was received with a mix of disbelief, heartbreak, and a profound, weary relief. These were men who had endured unimaginable hardship. They were starving, their uniforms were in tatters, and many were barefoot. They had fought with a fierce loyalty to their cause and to their beloved commander, General Lee. The idea of surrender was devastating. When General Lee rode back into his camp, he was immediately surrounded by his men. They pressed in, their faces etched with sorrow and questions. They reached out to touch him, to touch Traveler, seeking some final connection to the commander who had led them for so long. Tears streamed down the faces of these hardened veterans. They had given everything, and now it was over. Lee, his own emotions held tightly in check, tried to speak to them. His voice, usually so commanding, was thick with emotion. He told them, "Men, we have fought through the war together. I have done my best for you. My heart is too full to say more." He urged them to go home, to become good citizens, and to help rebuild their shattered land. For these soldiers, Lee's surrender was not a betrayal, but a final act of care for them. He had surrendered to prevent further, useless bloodshed. They understood this, and their love for him, in that moment of defeat, was perhaps stronger than it had ever been in victory. Across the field, Union soldiers watched this scene unfold. Men who had been trying to kill each other just a day before now looked upon one another with a newfound sense of shared humanity. Some Union soldiers began to cross the lines, not as conquerors, but as fellow Americans, offering food from their own haversacks to the starving Confederates. They shared coffee and tobacco. They spoke of home, of family, of the simple desire to put down their rifles and pick up their plows. These first tentative interactions between former enemies were the fragile beginnings of national reunion. The soldiers, the very men who had borne the brunt of the conflict, were often the first to extend the hand of friendship. They understood, in a way that politicians in distant capitals perhaps could not, the true cost of the war and the urgent need for peace. The quiet dignity of Grant and Lee at the McLean House had now filtered down to the common soldier. Setting a powerful example, in the days that followed, the formal process of surrender took place. The Confederate troops marched to a designated spot to stack their arms and furl their battle flags. The Union officer in charge of the ceremony, General Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, the hero of Little Round Top at Gettysburg, made a decision that would become one of the most moving moments of the entire war. As the defeated Confederates, led by General John B. Gordon, approached, Chamberlain ordered his Union troops to salute them. He ordered them to carry arms. The marching salute is a sign of respect from one soldier to another. General Gordon, stunned by this unexpected gesture of honor, immediately wheeled his horse and ordered his own men to return the salute. And so, the final act of the Army of Northern Virginia was not one of humiliation, but one of mutual, solemn respect. Two armies, battered and bloodied, acknowledged the courage and sacrifice of the other. It was a moment that captured the spirit of Grant S. and Lee S. Medinia, spirit of malice toward none and charity for all. The conclusion of the meeting at Appomattox was more than just the end of a battle. It was the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter for the United States. The dignified farewell between the two great generals, the quiet respect shown by the soldiers, and the shared understanding of the moment. This immense weight laid the foundation for the difficult road to reconciliation that lay ahead. It was a somber, respectful, and profoundly human end to America's most devastating conflict. Thank you for joining us for this chapter. The story of Appomattox is a powerful reminder that even in the aftermath of great conflict, honor, respect, and humanity can prevail. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll explore the final days of the war and the beginning of Reconstruction. Thanks for watching. Imagine, for a moment, a world without instant messages, without breaking news alerts on your phone. A world where the most important news of a generation travels not at the speed of light, but at the speed of a horse, a steam engine, or a runner's stride. This was the world of April 1865. The guns had fallen silent at but the war wasn't over until the word got out. And the story of how that news spread is a drama all its own. In the trenches and camps around Appomattox, the first to know were the soldiers themselves. The silence was the first message. That sudden, deafening quiet after 4 years of constant noise. Then came the official orders, read aloud by officers, two weary, disbelieving men. For the Union soldiers, it was a wave of pure elation. Hats flew into the air. Cheers echoed across the fields where their comrades had fallen just hours before. They had done it. They had survived. They were going home. For the Confederates, the news was a crushing weight. General Lee, their icon of defiance, had surrendered. It was a bitter, gut-wrenching end to a cause they had sacrificed everything for. Many wept openly, not just for the loss, but for the uncertainty of what came next. There was no victory parade for them, only the long, quiet walk home to farms and towns they might not even recognize. Yet, amidst the sorrow, there was also a flicker of relief. The killing was over. They, too, had survived. From Appomattox, the news began its journey. Telegraph lines, the 19th century internet, crackled to life. A coded message from Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was the spark. Lee surrendered this morning. Just for words that would change everything. In Washington, D.C., the message arrived and the city erupted. Cannons, meant for defense, were now fired in celebration. Government clerks poured into the streets, singing and shouting. People who were strangers just moments before embraced, united in a shared, national exhale. But the telegraph didn't reach everywhere. As the news radiated outward, it traveled by train. Conductors would shout the headlines at each stop, and crowds would gather, desperate for confirmation. Newspapers worked frantically. Special extras were printed, with giant, bold headlines. Surrender. The Union is preserved. B. Newsboys, their voices hoarse, ran through the streets of New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, selling history for a few cents a copy. People snatched the papers, reading the words aloud to illiterate neighbors, tears of joy streaming down their faces. Church bells, long silent or used only for warnings, now pealed in joyous celebration, ringing out for hours, a soundtrack of pure relief. Think about the sheer emotion in a city like Boston, a hub of abolitionism, a place that had sent so many of its sons to fight and die for the Union cause. When the news arrived, the city transformed. Businesses closed, but not for mourning. Their owners and workers were in the streets, joining spontaneous parades. The joy was tinged with solemn memory for the thousands who wouldn't be coming home, But it was joy nonetheless. The sacrifice, Danak Nyo, had not been in vain. Further west, the news traveled slower. In cities like Chicago and St. Louis, it took a day or more. The anticipation was agonizing. Rumors would fly, often false, but then the official telegram would arrive, and the same scenes of jubilation would play out. People lit bonfires, waved flags from every window, and sang patriotic songs late into the night. It was a collective release of 4 years of pent-up anxiety, fear, and grief. Now, picture the journey of the news into the heart of the defeated South. Here, the news was not carried by celebratory messengers, but often arrived with the slow, deliberate march of Union troops, or it came as a rumor, whispered in market squares, initially dismissed as Yankee propaganda. In cities like Charleston, the birthplace of secession, the news was met with stunned silence. The reality was too immense to process. The world they had built, the one they had fought to defend, was gone. For white Southerners, it was the beginning of a period of profound dislocation and loss. But for millions of African Americans, still enslaved in the parts of the South the war had not yet reached, this news was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the promise of Jubilee made real. The grapevine telegraph, that informal but incredibly effective network of communication among the enslaved, had been buzzing for weeks. But the official word, confirmation that Lee had surrendered, was deliverance. It was the sound of shackles breaking. In their fields, secret prayers were answered. Work stopped. People looked at each other, a slow, dawning realization in their eyes. They were free. It was a moment of quiet, sacred awe, followed by outpourings of joy, singing, dancing, and weeping, not in sorrow, but in overwhelming, world-altering happiness. This news wasn't just about the end of a war. It was the dawn of a new life. Out on the vast frontier, in the remote territories of the West, the news took weeks to arrive. A rider for the Pony Express or a weary traveler on a stagecoach might be the first to bring the tidings to a dusty mining camp or an isolated fort. Imagine being a soldier stationed in Arizona, still fighting skirmishes, completely unaware that the great national conflict was over. For them, the news felt like a message from another world. The war that had defined their service, that had been the backdrop to their entire lives for 4 years, had ended without them even knowing. Even across the ocean, in London, Paris, and other European capitals, the news was a sensation. Foreign governments had watched the American experiment teeter on the brink of collapse. The surrender of Lee was definitive proof that a republic, a government of the people, could survive a brutal internal war. It sent a powerful message about the resilience of democracy. Newspapers in Britain, many of which had been skeptical of the Union cause, now reported the end with a sense of awe. The United States had not broken apart. It had been forged anew in the crucible of war. Looking back, the way the news of the surrender spread is a powerful reflection of America itself in 1865. It was a nation of contrasts, of telegraphs and horse-drawn wagons, of bustling cities and isolated farms, of profound joy and devastating loss. It was a nation connected and yet deeply divided. The arrival of the news in each community tells a unique story. In the North, a story of victory and relief. In the South, a story of defeat and upheaval. For African Americans, a story of liberation and hope. The end of the Civil War wasn't a single event that happened on April 9th at Appomattox. It was a process, a wave of information and emotion that washed over the country, town by town, heart by heart. It was the final chapter of the war and the first page of a new, uncertain, and challenging era of reconstruction and reconciliation. The news brought relief, but it also brought questions. What now? How does a nation heal from such a wound? How do former enemies live together as countrymen? The war was over, but the struggle for the soul of America was just beginning. Thank you so much for watching. This period of history is filled with such powerful human stories. If you found this journey into the past meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more. We'll see you in the next chapter. As the month of April 1865 dawned, the long, bloody shadow of the American Civil War began to recede. 4 years of brutal conflict had torn the nation apart, pitting brother against brother, and scarring the landscape with battlefields that would forever be remembered in the annals of history. The air, once thick with the smoke of cannon fire and the cries of the wounded, was finally clearing. revealing a nation exhausted, grieving, but tentatively hopeful. The final act of this great American tragedy was playing out, not with a single climactic battle, but with a series of surrenders that marked the definitive end of the Confederate States of America. On April 2nd, the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, fell to Union forces. For years, this city had been the heart of the rebellion, the symbol of Southern defiance. Its capture was a devastating blow to the Confederacy's morale and its ability to continue the fight. General Robert E. Lee, the revered commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, found his forces stretched thin, undersupplied, and relentlessly pursued by the larger, better-equipped Union Army under General Ulysses S. Grant. Lee's men were starving. Their uniforms were in tatters, and their hope was dwindling with each passing mile of their retreat. The decisive moment came just 1 week later. On April 9th, 1865, in the small village of Appomattox Court House, Virginia, General Lee met with General Grant to discuss the terms of surrender. The meeting took place in the parlor of a private home owned by Wilmer McLean. In a strange twist of fate, the war had effectively begun in McLean's backyard at the First Battle of Bull Run, and now it was ending in his living room. The two generals presented a study in contrasts. Grant, dressed in a mud-splattered private's uniform, appeared unassuming. Lee, on the other hand, was immaculate in his full-dress uniform, complete with a sash and sword, a dignified figure even in defeat. The terms Grant offered were surprisingly generous, a reflection of President Abraham Lincoln's own desire for a magnanimous peace and a swift reconciliation. Confederate soldiers would not be imprisoned or prosecuted for treason. They were simply required to lay down their arms and promise to no longer fight against the United States. Grant even allowed the men to keep their horses and mules to help them with the spring planting when they returned home. As Lee rode away, Union soldiers began to cheer, but Grant immediately ordered them to stop. "The war is over," he told his men. "The rebels are our countrymen again." This act of respect set the tone for what many hoped would be a peaceful and unifying healing process. News of Lee's surrender spread like wildfire, igniting celebrations across the North. Church bells rang, cannons fired salutes, and people poured into the streets, singing and embracing. The war, which had claimed over 620,000 lives and inflicted immeasurable suffering, was finally over. The Union had been preserved. In Washington, D.C., a crowd gathered at the White House, calling for President Lincoln. He appeared at a window and spoke not of victory or triumph, but of the monumental task that lay ahead, the task of binding up the nation's wounds. His vision was not for punishment, but for reconstruction, for malice toward none, and charity for all. However, the euphoria was tragically short-lived. Just 5 days after Lee's surrender, on the evening of April 14th, President Lincoln and his wife Mary attended a play at Ford's Theater. A well-known actor and fervent Confederate sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth slipped into the presidential box and shot Lincoln in the back of the head. The president was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he died the next morning. The nation, which had just begun to celebrate peace, was plunged back into mourning. The man who had steered the country through its darkest hour, the great emancipator who had fought to preserve the Union and end slavery, was gone. Lincoln's assassination sent shockwaves of grief and anger throughout the country. It was a senseless act of violence that robbed the nation of the one leader who seemed to possess the wisdom and compassion to guide it through the difficult process of reconciliation. Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southerner who had remained loyal to the Union, was sworn in as president. But Johnson lacked Lincoln's political skill, his vision, and his deep-seated humanity. The dream of a gentle, forgiving Reconstruction would soon face the harsh realities of political infighting, racial prejudice, and economic devastation. While Lee's surrender at Appomattox is often seen as the end of the war, it was not the final surrender. Other Confederate forces scattered across the South had yet to lay down their arms. General Joseph E. Johnston's army in North Carolina, the second largest Confederate force, surrendered to General William T. Sherman on April 26th. In May, Confederate forces in Alabama and Mississippi. The final surrender of a significant Confederate land force occurred on June 2nd, when General Edmund Kirby Smith surrendered his troops in the Trans-Mississippi Department. The war at sea also came to a close, with the Confederate raider CSS Shenandoah finally surrendering in Liverpool, England, in November 1865, its crew having been unaware the war had ended for months. So, as April 1865 drew to a close, the guns had fallen silent. The soldiers, both blue and gray, began the long journey home. They returned to farms left untended, 2 cities scarred by battle, and 2 families irrevocably altered by loss. The physical landscape of the South was one of utter devastation. Railroads were destroyed, bridges were burned, and entire cities, like Atlanta and Columbia, lay in ruins. The region's economy, which had been built on the institution of slavery, was completely shattered. And what of the nearly 4 million African Americans who were now free? Emancipation was a momentous victory, a promise of liberty that had been denied for centuries. But freedom did not immediately translate into equality or security. Freedmen and women faced immense challenges. They had no land, no money, and few possessions. They sought to reunite with family members who had been sold away, to establish their own communities, to build schools and churches, and to claim their rightful place as citizens of the United States. Their future, and indeed the future of the entire nation, now hinged on the promises and perils of Reconstruction. The end of the Civil War was not merely the conclusion of a military conflict. It was the beginning of a new, uncertain, and profoundly challenging chapter in American history. The questions facing the nation were immense. How would the seceded states be readmitted to the Union? What would be the status of the former Confederate leaders and soldiers? And, most critically, what would be the rights and role of the newly freed African Americans in society? The answers to these questions would be debated and fought over for the next decade and beyond. The period of Reconstruction would be marked by both progress and bitter setbacks. It would see the passage of constitutional amendments aimed at guaranteeing civil rights, but it would also witness the rise of violent resistance and the implementation of laws designed to enforce racial segregation. April 1865 was a turning point. It marked the end of a war that had redefined the United States, settling the questions of Union and slavery through bloodshed. But as the echoes of the last cannon shot faded, a deeper, more complex struggle began. It was the struggle to heal a wounded nation, to rebuild a broken society, and to fulfill the promise of a more perfect union for all its people. The war had ended, but the arduous work of mending the heart of America, of truly becoming one nation, indivisible, had only just begun. The quiet that fell over the battlefields was not just an absence of noise, but a space for reflection, a moment for a nation to catch its breath before facing the long and difficult road to recovery that stretched out before it.